The silence after the crowd leaves has a different weight to it when the crowd was never really there to begin with. It is not the ringing, celebratory emptiness of a stadium that has just witnessed history. It is a hollow, thin silence, polluted by the echo of your own footsteps on concrete and the distant sound of a lone janitor sweeping up forgotten programs. This is the silence that greeted the men of the 1925 Canton Bulldogs as they walked off the field for what would be, though they did not know it yet, the final time. They did not walk off as champions. They did not walk off to the adulation of a packed city. They walked off from a loss, to the apathy of a town that had already moved on. Their shoulders slumped not just from fatigue, but from the bewildering burden of obsolescence. Just 2 years earlier, these same men, or at least the idea of them, had been declared world champions. They were the bedrock of professional football, the standard against which all toughness and grit were measured. And now they were ghosts, playing out a schedule in a league that had already consumed their spirit and was now discarding their shell. This is not a story about a team that lost. This is a story about a team that was erased.
It's all right, honey.
And in that erasure, in the cold administrative efficiency of its dissolution, lies the secret DNA of the entire National Football League. The fall of the Canton Bulldogs was not an accident of history. It was a necessary surgery. The patient was the league itself, bleeding out from the chaos of its own infancy, and the Bulldogs were the infected limb that had to be amputated for the body to survive. What grew back in its place was not a healthier version of the old game. It was something new, something hardened, something designed for permanence and control above all else. To understand the modern NFL, its immense power, its ruthless efficiency, its cold-blooded business calculus, you must start here, in this hollow silence of a half-empty stadium in a fading Ohio town. You must start with the moment the champions died, and the empire was born. I think about those final games. The newspaper reports are sparse, buried behind news of local politics and factory jobs. The headlines lack the fervor of just a season or two prior. There is a perfunctory tone, as if the reporters themselves are bored by the obligation. The Bulldogs, once a source of municipal pride so potent it helped launch a national league, are now a civic afterthought. The men on the field are not legends. They are hired hands, replacements for the legends who had been lured away or simply quit. They wear the same colors, but the meaning has been vacuumed out. Every snap is a pantomime of past glory. Every tackle echoes with a memory that the present can no longer sustain. And in the stands, the few who remain are not the rabid faithful of the early 20s. They are the curious, the nostalgic, or those simply looking for a way to pass a Sunday afternoon. The connection between team and town, that vital, emotional circuitry that powers all sport, has been severed. The Bulldogs are playing on borrowed time in a borrowed identity, and everyone can feel it. The mystery that has haunted me is not why they lost games. It is why anyone expected them to do anything else. How does a championship organism, a team that lost only 2 games in 3 seasons, simply disintegrate? In nature, such a rapid decline suggests a poisoned environment, a catastrophic failure of the ecosystem that sustained it. And that is precisely what happened. The NFL in 1925 was a poisoned environment. It was a frontierland of financial banditry, player piracy, and institutional chaos. The strong did not survive. They were cannibalized by the desperate. Canton was the strongest, and so Canton was eaten first. I can picture Guy Chamberlain, the cornerstone of those championship teams, watching this decay from a distance. By 1925, he was player coaching for the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, another team, another paycheck. He was a winner, perhaps the most fundamentally successful player coach in the league's early history, a man whose very presence engineered championships. But he was also a practical man in an impractical business. The league had no loyalty to him, and so he had none to it. His departure from Canton was not a betrayal. It was an inevitability. The bonds that held a team together were purely financial, and the finances of pro football were a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Chamberlain moved to where the money was or where it was promised. Most of his teammates did the same. The championship roster was scattered to the winds by the simple, relentless gravity of a few extra dollars a game. There was no greater cause, no franchise legacy, no fan base to honor. There was only the next paycheck and the next town. This was the reality of the professional football player at the dawn of the NFL. He was a migrant laborer, his skills his only tool, his body his only capital. The team was not an institution. It was a temporary gathering, a seasonal contract between a group of men and a local businessman with a field. When the Bulldog players looked around their locker room in 1925, they did not see brothers in arms. They saw strangers wearing familiar sweaters. The soul had departed. What remained was a logo, a schedule, and a slow public withering. And then there is Jim Thorpe. His shadow is long over this entire story, and it is a shadow tinged with profound sadness. By 1925, Thorpe was 37, a fading force, playing his last, disconnected games for the Bulldogs. He was less a player and more a living monument trotted out for his name. The world still knew him as the greatest athlete alive, the Olympic champion, the mythic figure who gave professional football a sliver of legitimacy in its roughest days. But the league had used him up. Canton had used him up. They had marketed his fame, sold tickets on the back of his legend. And now, as his skills eroded, they had no use for the man behind the myth. Thorpe's final season with Canton is a metaphor for the entire enterprise. The exploitation of glory until nothing but the husk remains. He was the first superstar of the NFL, and he was also its first ghost. He haunted those 1925 games, a reminder of what had been, a stark contrast to what now was. His presence did not inspire the new Bulldogs. It likely confused them. They were trying to win a football game. He was carrying the weight of a fading American legend. When he walked off that field for the last time, he was walking out of professional football into a life of struggle and obscurity. Another piece of collateral damage in the league's messy, unforgiving birth. The treatment of Jim Thorpe was the original sin, the template for how the NFL would treat its legends for the next century. Celebrate them lavishly when they can draw a crowd, and discard them with bureaucratic coldness when they cannot. So we are left with this final, haunting image. A cold afternoon in Canton, Ohio. A few thousand people in the stands, their breath visible in the November air. A team of strangers going through the motions. A legend playing out the string. And on the sidelines, the owners and league officials watching not the game, but the ledger. They saw the empty seats. They calculated the losses. They understood that the model was broken. The wild, anarchic, every-town-for-itself system that had created the Canton Bulldogs could just as easily destroy them, and was in the process of doing so in real time. The champion's demise was the clearest possible signal that professional football could not survive as a collection of independent warlords. It needed a central power. It needed rules that favored the stability of the league over the fortunes of any single team or player. It needed, in a word, order. The death rattle of the Canton Bulldogs was the birth cry of the modern NFL. The silence after their final game was not an ending. It was a vacuum. And nature, especially the nature of American business, abhors a vacuum. Into that silence would step men with blueprints and constitutions, men who saw in Canton's rubble the foundation for an empire. But before we examine that new construction, we must fully understand what was torn down. We must comprehend the chaotic, brutal, and ultimately unsustainable world that the Bulldogs ruled, and the precise mechanisms of their fall. Their story is the prologue to everything that follows, the dark, forgotten origin story of the most powerful sports league on earth. The story of the Canton Bulldogs' demise is often treated as a curious footnote, a quaint piece of trivia from the league's ragamuffin youth. It is presented as an anomaly, the unfortunate stumble of an early powerhouse before the league found its footing. This is a profound misreading of history. What happened in Canton between 1922 and 1925 was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable conclusion of professional football's original, unsustainable design. It was, in fact, Genesis. The collapse of its first true dynasty served as the crucible in which the modern NFL was forged. The league looked into the abyss of its own chaos, saw the reflection of Canton's empty grandstands and scattered champions, and made a conscious, ruthless choice. It chose order over chaos, control over competition, and the permanence of the institution over the welfare of the individual team or player. The fall of the Bulldogs is the foundational tragedy, the original sin, from which all the league's subsequent virtues and pathologies would grow. To understand this, we must first discard the myth of linear progress. The NFL did not organically evolve from a loose collection of town teams into a slick corporate entity. It was violently reformed. The early 1920s were not a simpler time. They were a more brutal and volatile one. Professional football was a fringe enterprise, a desperate scramble for legitimacy and dollars played out in industrial towns across the Midwest. There was no collective vision, only individual survival. Teams popped in and out of existence based on the whims and wallets of local businessmen. Players were not employees in any modern sense. They were freelance mercenaries, often playing for multiple teams in a single season. Their loyalties measured strictly by the cash offered each Saturday or Sunday. They would jump from team to rival team between games, a practice known as player jumping. The concept of a stable roster was a fantasy. The concept of a player's health being a long-term investment was laughable. You were paid for this week's game, for this week's bruises. Next week was a problem for next week's paycheck. This was the ecosystem the Canton Bulldogs mastered, and for a brief, glorious period, they ruled it. They were the creation of a specific time and place, the gritty, blue-collar pride of an Ohio manufacturing hub. Their championships were built on local talent and shrewd acquisitions, but they were built on the same unstable ground as every other franchise. Their success was personal, not institutional. It was tied to the leadership of men like Guy Chamberlain and the local patronage that funded them. There was no league-wide revenue sharing, no television contract, no merchandising. Survival depended on gate receipts, and gate receipts depended on winning, and winning depended on who could pay the most for the best weekly talent. It was a perfect engine for cyclical instability. And Canton, by reaching the pinnacle, made itself the biggest target. Into this volatile mix walked the owners, the rival warlords. Men like Ralph Hay of the Bulldogs, George Halas of the Decatur Staleys, and later, the Cleveland-based syndicate led by Sam Deutsch. They were part coaches, part promoters, full-time hustlers. Their alliances shifted with their financial interests. They were competitors on the field and in the bidding wars for players, but they were also reluctantly partners in the fragile enterprise of the American Professional Football Association, which would rename itself the National Football League in 1922. The league office had no real power. It was a talking shop, a means to loosely coordinate schedules and declare a champion, but it could not enforce rules, control salaries, or prevent the predatory behavior that was slowly killing its members. The owners were like barons in a kingdom with no king, each fortifying their own castle, even if it meant stealing the stones from their neighbors' walls. The story of the NFL's first decade is the story of these men realizing that their unchecked competition was leading them all toward mutual ruin. The fall of Canton was the catastrophic proof they could no longer ignore. And presiding over this entire chaotic panorama, a figure both elevated and trapped by it, was Jim Thorpe. His assignment to the Canton Bulldogs in 1915 was not just a transaction. It was a seminal event in the sport's history. It lent a patina of Olympic glory and national fame to a roughneck game played in industrial parks. Thorpe was the league's first marketing department, its first star attraction. He put fans in seats simply by being Jim Thorpe. But the relationship was purely extractive. The league and the team took his fame and gave back only a salary and, eventually, discardment. Thorpe's journey from global icon to a fading name on a fading team's roster is the human heart of this origin story. He was the prototype for every athlete who would ever be used up by this business. He was the first to learn that the NFL could love what you represent while being utterly indifferent to who you are. His final, wistful years in the league, dragging his aging body through games for teams like the Bulldogs, mirrored the league's own adolescence. All potential and raw power, but without a coherent plan for the future, without a system for care or legacy. So when the end came for Canton, it was not a mystery. It was a case study. A Cleveland-based business syndicate, seeing the value of the championship roster, simply bought the entire Canton franchise after the 1923 season. Their goal was not to sustain the Bulldogs. It was to harvest them. They took the name, the players, the championship pedigree, and moved it all to Cleveland, creating the 1924 Cleveland Bulldogs. What was left in Canton was a ghost franchise, a shell corporation with a name and a schedule but no soul. They tried to field a team of leftovers and replacements, but the spirit was gone. The fans felt the betrayal deeply. We will trace the direct line from the solutions crafted in 1925 to the monolithic league we know today. We will see how the blueprint written to save the NFL from itself established the fundamental power dynamic that would define every subsequent battle. Owners versus players, league versus individual, control versus agency. The concussion lawsuits, the labor strikes, the franchise relocations, the careful management of scandal. All of these modern conflicts are played out on a battlefield whose contours were drawn by the fall of the Canton Bulldogs. Their story is the prologue. It is the story of the sacrifice that made the empire possible. To know why the NFL operates with such cool, calculated authority, you must first understand the desperate, chaotic fire it was built to contain. To understand the fall, you must first appreciate the height, the pinnacle, the peak from which the drop was so catastrophic. For the Canton Bulldogs, that peak was a stretch of 25 games spanning the 1922 and 1923 seasons. In that time, they lost only once. They were not just winning. They were imposing a new standard of ruthless, mechanical efficiency on a league known for its charming disarray. They were the first professional football machine. And at the controls was a man whose name has faded from common memory, but whose influence on the early shape of the game is imprinted on every one of those victories. Guy Chamberlain. He was not just the star end, a formidable both offensive and defensive force. He was the player coach. He was the strategist, the disciplinarian, the living catalyst that transformed a group of talented men from the Ohio factories and farms into a singular, punishing entity. Under Chamberlain, the Bulldogs did not merely play football. They executed it with a cold, systematic precision that felt alien in an era of freelance chaos. Watching film, though there is precious little of it, or reading the accounts of sports writers of the time, you get a sense of a team that was always a step ahead, both physically and mentally. Chamberlain believed in conditioning when many teams still treated training as an occasional nuisance. He installed simple, repetitive plays and drilled them until they were instinct. The famous Massillon shift, a predecessor to modern motion, was run not with flashy deception but with the grim, coordinated certainty of a piston firing. This was football stripped of frivolity. It was industrial production applied to sport. The product was victory, and the Bulldogs' assembly line rarely jammed. The environment that bred this champion was the Ohio League, a circuit that was less a formal organization and more a testament to the brutal, localized pride of the state's industrial heartland. Games between Canton, Massillon, Akron, and Columbus were not mere athletic contests. They were civic warfare. Towns that were rivals in the production of steel, bricks, and bearings translated that competition to the football field on Sunday afternoons. The players were not distant celebrities. They were your neighbor, the foreman from the machine shop, the big kid who'd starred at the local high school. They played for the literal honor of their city, and for a share of the gate receipts that could double a working man's weekly wage. The violence on the field was a reflection of the physical reality of life in these towns. It was uncompromising and direct. There was a purity to this rivalry, a raw connection between team and community that the modern NFL, for all its marketing, strains to replicate. The Canton Bulldogs were the ultimate expression of this Ohio pride. They were Canton's team, funded by local businessmen like Ralph Hay, who owned a car dealership and saw the team as both a passion and a promotion. The players lived in the community, worked off-season jobs in it, and on game day, they embodied its resilient, blue-collar spirit. Their championship was not a national story. It was a local epic. The parade that celebrated their 1922 title wound through the streets of Canton, past the factories and row houses, for the people who had invested their identity in these men. This was the fortress from which they ruled. It was powerful, but it was also insular. Its walls were made of local cash and local passion, and its foundations were shallow. Because for all their on-field dominance, the financial architecture of the Canton Bulldogs dynasty was perilously fragile. There was no security, no long-term planning. The team was run on a season-to-season, almost game-to-game basis. Player salaries were the primary expense, and they were paid from the gate receipts of the previous week. A rainy Sunday that kept fans away could mean scrambling to meet payroll. A rainy Sunday that kept fans away could mean scrambling to meet payroll. There were no television rights fees, no league-wide merchandising, no luxury suite revenue. The business was cash in, cash out. Ralph Hay and his fellow backers were not billionaires with diversified portfolios. They were local entrepreneurs for whom the Bulldogs were a risky, passionate side venture. The team's success was both a blessing and a curse. It raised expectations and therefore costs. To stay on top, they had to compete for the best talent, which meant bidding against rivals like the Chicago Bears or the new franchise in Green Bay. A championship-caliber player like Chamberlain himself or a tackle like Link Lyman could demand a higher salary, knowing their worth was proven. The Bulldogs' very excellence was making them more expensive to operate, while their revenue streams remained stubbornly local and finite. They were victims of their own success, trapped in a cycle where winning cost more. But the rewards of winning did not scale beyond the capacity of their small city stadium. You can see the cracks if you know where to look. The meticulousness of Chamberlain's coaching was, in part, a response to this financial reality. He could not simply outspend everyone to assemble an all-star roster. He had to be smarter, more efficient. He maximized the value of every player he had. He built a system where discipline and execution could overcome a slight talent deficit, though his teams often had the talent too. This efficiency was the hallmark of their dynasty, but it was also a symptom of their constraints. They were a beautifully engineered machine, but they were running on a finite fuel supply. Every other team in the league operated under similar constraints, of course. But Canton was at the top of the pyramid. The pressure on them was greatest, and the vultures were circling. Other owners in larger cities or with deeper-pocketed syndicates looked at Canton's model with envy. They saw not a sacred local institution, but a collection of championship assets being managed on a shoestring budget. The idea that those assets, that winning culture built by Chamberlain, could be separated from the town of Canton and transplanted elsewhere began to simmer in the minds of men like Sam Deutsch in Cleveland. In their view, Canton was wasting a national-caliber product on a local audience. The very localized pride that forged the Bulldogs was now their greatest vulnerability. Their identity was rooted in a place, but their players' contracts were rooted in nothing more than a weekly promise. That disconnect would prove fatal. And then there was the complicating factor of Jim Thorpe. By 1922, Thorpe was still on the Canton roster, but his role had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer the central force. That torch had passed to Chamberlain. Thorpe was now a legendary figurehead, a living attraction. His name on the roster brought a certain prestige and drew curious fans, but his contributions on the field were diminishing. He was a symbol of the past, while Chamberlain was the architect of the present. This created a subtle but important tension within the dynasty's narrative. The team's current success was built on Chamberlain's modern, systematic approach, yet a portion of its fame and drawing power still relied on the fading aura of Thorpe's individual genius from a previous era. It was a bridge between two football worlds, the age of the singular, mythic athlete and the dawn of the organized, systemic team. The Bulldogs were trying to inhabit both worlds simultaneously. They were leveraging Thorpe's legend for ticket sales while building their victories on a model that had less and less to do with him. It was a precarious balance, and it spoke to the underlying commercial desperation. Even at the height of their powers, they needed the ghost of past glory to help pay the bills for their current reality. This duality, this need to monetize nostalgia while forging a new future, is a theme that would haunt the league for a century. The Canton Bulldogs, at their peak, were already showing the strain of the contradictions that would eventually tear them apart. They were a perfect machine, but they were running in an imperfect and ultimately hostile marketplace. The very things that made them great, their local pride, their systemic efficiency, their connection to a fading legend, were the things that made them a target. The dynasty was glorious, but it was built on ice. He arrived not as a player, but as a deity descending to lend his glory to a lesser realm. When the Canton Bulldogs signed Jim Thorpe in 1915, it was not a simple athletic transaction. It was an act of profound symbolic alchemy. Here was the man proclaimed by King Gustav V of Sweden as the greatest athlete in the world, the Olympic gold medalist in the decathlon and pentathlon, a collegiate football force of nature, now aligning himself with a professional team in an Ohio industrial town. For Canton, and for the struggling concept of professional football itself, it was a transfusion of legitimacy. Thorpe's presence answered a silent, pervasive question hanging over the paid game. Was this merely a crude pastime for brutes, or could it be a stage for true, world-class athletes? Thorpe was the answer. He was the living proof that the sport could be a destination, not just a gritty secret. But from the very beginning, this relationship was defined by a fundamental and ultimately tragic asymmetry. Canton and later the entire NFL did not see Jim Thorpe the man. They saw Jim Thorpe the symbol. They saw his fame, his myth, his marketability. They saw a human shortcut to respectability. And in that reduction, in that conversion of a person into a promotional tool, lies the original template for how this league would forever treat its transcendent figures. Thorpe was the first to experience the full cycle: deification, exploitation, and eventual discard. He was the prototype. His early years in Canton were a fusion of myth and reality. On the field, even past his absolute prime, he was a formidable presence. He could run, pass, kick, and tackle with a versatile prowess that few could match. He played with an instinctive, almost joyful physicality that captivated crowds. But his value rapidly transcended his statistics. The mere announcement "Jim Thorpe plays here" was enough to fill grandstands. Towns that would never have given a second glance to a professional football game turned out in throngs to witness the legend. He was the headline act, the tent pole that allowed the rest of the show to go on. The Bulldogs and the league's early organizers understood this perfectly. They leveraged his name for survival and growth. He was sent on barnstorming tours, playing exhibition games across the country, literally carrying the gospel of professional football to skeptical regions. He was less a player and more an ambassador, a missionary of the emerging sport. His salary, while historically significant, was not merely payment for performance. It was a licensing fee for his legend. Canton was paying to attach its name to his aura. And Thorpe, for his part, often seemed trapped by the very fame that empowered him. He was a Sac and Fox Native American man navigating a white-dominated society that cherished his athletic prowess but was deeply ambivalent about his identity. He was celebrated, yet othered. He was a draw, yet often denied the basic dignities and business savvy that should have accompanied his status. The league and its teams took everything his name could give, but offered little in terms of lasting security or post-career planning. The transaction was always short-term. As the 1920s dawned and the NFL formalized, a subtle but decisive shift occurred. The game began to change. It became slightly more organized, more systematic. The era of the sheer, unstructured athletic marvel was giving way just a fraction to the era of the scheme. And Jim Thorpe, now entering his mid-30s, was the quintessential marvel. His body, after a lifetime of monumental athletic exertion, was beginning to betray him. The speed diminished. The recovery took longer. The injuries lingered. Meanwhile, the Canton Bulldogs were evolving under the direction of Guy Chamberlain into that very model of system-based efficiency. Thorpe's role diminished. He was no longer the central engine of the team's success. He was a part-time player, a situational contributor. Yet, his commercial value remained undiminished, perhaps even heightened by the pathos of his fading powers. People still came to see Jim Thorpe, even if they were now watching a poignant echo. The Bulldogs and the league continued to market him aggressively, often placing his name at the top of advertisements long after his on-field impact had waned. This created a dissonant, almost cruel dynamic. He was being sold as the main attraction while being utilized as a supporting actor. He was a landmark, a statue that crowds came to see, while the actual game moved on around him. The business extracted the last bits of commercial value from his legacy, even as the sport itself rendered his specific talents increasingly obsolete. He was becoming a living museum exhibit, toured out for applause before the real work of winning football games, now orchestrated by Chamberlain, took place. The emotional toll of this transition must have been immense. To have been the sun around which an entire sport revolved, and to then feel that world gradually, politely, turning its axis toward new sources of light. Thorpe was prideful. a man of immense personal dignity despite the hardships inflicted upon him by a discriminatory society. To be reduced to a ceremonial figure, a name on a poster used to sell tickets for a team whose strategic core he was no longer part of, must have been a private humiliation. There is a quiet tragedy in the newspaper accounts from those later Canton seasons. The descriptions of his play become tinged with nostalgia, with a sense of once was. They speak of flashes of the old brilliance, a tackle that recalled his power, a run that hinted at his former grace. But the language is elegiac. It is the language of farewell even as he still suited up. The fans, too, participated in this bittersweet ritual. They cheered for him with a different kind of fervor, not for what he would do, but for what he had done. Their applause was for the memory he embodied, and the league's machinery, utterly unsentimental, converted that nostalgia directly into revenue. Every ticket sold to a fan wanting one last glimpse of Thorpe was proof of concept. It proved a legend could be monetized long after his peak. The final act of this foundational drama was the discard. By 1925, the Canton franchise was itself a hollow shell, and Thorpe's time there was over. He played a few final, fragmented seasons for other teams like the Rock Island Independents and the New York Giants, but the pattern was the same. He was a name, a curiosity, a draw for a game or two. There was no lasting place for him. When his usefulness as an attraction finally expired, the league simply moved on. There was no ceremony, no league-wide retirement tribute, no guaranteed pension, no transition into coaching or front office role. The machine spat him out. Jim Thorpe, the man who had done more than any single individual to make professional football a credible spectacle, was left to wander through a post-athletic wilderness of bit parts in movies, sporadic manual labor, and financial struggle. The league that had built its early identity upon his shoulders showed no institutional loyalty to the man himself. He was the first to experience the cold truth that the NFL's love is conditional. It is conditioned on utility. When your utility as a player ends, so does the league's active interest in you, unless it can continue to commodify your legacy. Thorpe's later life was a stark, human counterpoint to the glittering champion he had been. It was the bill coming due for all that early, unrestrained exploitation. In this way, Jim Thorpe's story is not merely a historical anecdote. It is the archetype. He established the emotional and economic blueprint for the relationship between the NFL and its legends. He was the first to learn that the league is a brilliant, relentless extractor of value. It extracts the physical value of your prime, the commercial value of your fame, and even the nostalgic value of your decline. But the moment the cost of maintenance exceeds the immediate revenue you can generate, the institution's gaze turns elsewhere. Every subsequent legend, from Johnny Unitas to Joe Namath to even modern stars, exists within the framework of this Thorpean dynamic. The benefits are greater now, the rewards vaster, but the fundamental transaction remains. The individual's talent and persona are absorbed into the machine of the league, and the machine's loyalty is to its own perpetual motion, not to the individuals who fuel it. Thorpe's tragedy was to be the first to undergo this process before anyone understood what it was. He was a pioneer on the field, and a pioneer in the bleak hinterland that lies beyond it. His shadow is long, and it falls across every negotiation, every retirement, every struggle of a former player trying to reclaim his identity after the game has taken everything it wanted. He was the god of football, and the NFL, in its infancy, learned that even gods could be used up. If the Canton Bulldogs represented a fleeting moment of order, a glimpse of what professional football could become, then the league they played in was everything else. It was the chaotic opposite. The National Football League of the early 1920s was not a sports league as we understand the term today. It was a frontier, a barely mapped territory of shifting alliances, volatile economics, and raw, unchecked competition where every man and every town was for themselves. There were no rules, only temporary agreements. There was no authority, only the persuasive power of a paycheck or a threat. This was the ecosystem that both nurtured Canton's dynasty and, ultimately, created the precise conditions for its destruction. To understand the fall, you must first understand the anarchic world in which that dynasty was an improbable miracle. This was a world where a championship team could be picked apart between Sunday and Tuesday, where the schedule was a speculative fiction, and where the very concept of a stable franchise was a laughable fantasy. It was a world running on cash, ego, and pure momentum, and it was hurtling toward a cliff. Nothing better exemplified this chaos than the rampant, commonplace practice of player jumping. The idea of a player being the property of a single team, bound by a contract for a season, was a quaint notion often ignored. Players were independent contractors in the truest, most mercenary sense. Their loyalty was to their own wallet, and the bidding for their services was open and constant. It was not uncommon for a star player to suit up for one team on a Sunday, and then, if a rival town offered him $10 or $20 more for the following weekend, to jump on a train and play for their opponent the very next Sunday. The entire roster of a team could be in flux from week to week. There are documented cases of teams literally meeting at the train station before a road game to see who had actually shown up for the trip, and then scouring the local sandlots for replacements to fill out the squad. Guy Chamberlain himself was a product of this system before he brought order to Canton. He played for 3 different teams in 1921. This fluidity created a surreal and unstable competitive environment. You could design a play for a specific opposing linebacker on Wednesday, only to find he was now lining up as your guard on Sunday. The notion of building a team chemistry, of developing coordinated strategies over years, was nearly impossible. Canton's ability to maintain a core group under Chamberlain was a monumental achievement, a defiance of the natural disorder of the times. But it made them a towering target. In this world, a successful team was not a model to be emulated. It was a reservoir of talent to be raided. The Bulldogs' cohesive roster was like a discovered gold vein, and every prospector with a little cash was eyeing it. The financial underpinning of this chaos was just as volatile. Salaries were not standardized or even privately negotiated with any secrecy. They were public knowledge, part of the weekly gossip. Pay was based almost entirely on a player's perceived drawing power or immediate need. A star like Thorpe or a versatile force like Chamberlain could command a premium, but even their paychecks were subject to the health of the gate receipts. Most players were paid per game, and often the money came from the ticket sales of that very day. If it rained, if a rival attraction drew the crowd, the players might get a fraction of what they were promised. There were no signing bonuses, no guaranteed money, no health insurance, and certainly no pensions. It was piecework. This created a hand-to-mouth existence for the athletes and a precarious financial model for the teams. An owner like Ralph Hay in Canton was not a billionaire oligarch. He was a local businessman who had to cover weekly payrolls from the cash collected at the gate the week before. A single bad weather day or a poorly promoted home game could trigger a financial crisis. This system incentivized short-term thinking at every level. For the player, it meant taking the highest offer for the next game with no thought for a career arc. For the owner, it meant focusing on the immediate draw, the big name that would fill seats this Sunday, rather than investing in long-term player development or infrastructure. The entire economic model was a feedback loop of instability. The lack of contract security caused player jumping, which prevented team stability, which undermined fan loyalty and consistent gate revenue, which made financial planning impossible, which forced owners to operate week to week, which prevented them from offering secure contracts. It was a perfect, self-perpetuating cycle of chaos. This financial and personnel bedlam was mirrored in the league's operational farce, most notably in its scheduling. The NFL schedule in 1922 or 1923 was not a meticulously planned matrix released to the public in the spring. It was a loose, evolving tapestry of verbal agreements, telegrams, and desperate last-minute phone calls. Teams would independently arrange games with each other, often just weeks or even days in advance. The league office, such as it was, had little power to enforce a coherent structure. The result was a comical and unprofessional disparity. Some teams might play 15 games in a season, others as few as 6. The official standings were a mess, with winning percentages calculated from wildly different numbers of contests. The concept of a balanced schedule, where each team played the same number of games, was a distant dream. This scheduling anarchy further eroded the legitimacy of the league's championship. Canton might be crowned champion based on their record in a set of games they managed to arrange, while a team in another part of the country with a comparable record might have played a completely different set of opponents. It It was less a championship and more acclaim, backed by the persuasive power of local sports writers. This lack of a central, authoritative schedule also meant that for owners, filling a season slate was a constant hustle. It opened the door for barnstorming games against non-league teams, for last-minute cancellations, and for the constant financial uncertainty that came with not knowing your future revenue streams. You were not running a franchise, you were promoting a series of independent events, each one a financial gamble. Beneath all of this, the most critical absence was the absence of a central authority with real power. The NFL president, initially Jim Thorpe in a figurehead role and later Joseph Carr, presided over a collection of fiercely independent warlords, not a unified corporation. The owners saw themselves as allies of convenience, but ultimately as competitors. League meetings were less about building a shared future and more about negotiating temporary truces in an ongoing war. There was no mechanism to stop an owner from raiding another's roster. There was no rule to prevent an owner from moving his team, or his players, to another city on a whim. There was no collective bargaining agreement because there was no collective. It was every fiefdom for itself. This is the crucial context for Canton's predicament. Their success was built within a system that had no protections for success. The league provided no shield for its champion. In fact, the champion was the most attractive target. The other owners, particularly those in larger markets or with syndicate backing, looked at Canton not with reverence, but with opportunism. They saw a brilliantly constructed team operating in a small market, vulnerable to financial pressure, and held together by threads of local pride and personal loyalty that the rest of the league's chaos actively worked to unravel. The very anarchy that defined the NFL was, minute by minute, week by week, pulling at the seams of the Bulldogs dynasty. The league was not a container holding its teams. It was a tempest, and Canton had built a magnificent but exposed castle on its shore. The storm that was about to hit had no name, but it had a city, Cleveland. And it had a man who looked at the chaos and saw not danger, but the perfect cover for a predatory strike. The predator entered the scene not with a roar, but with the quiet rustle of paper and the cold clink of currency. His name was Samuel Sam Deutsch, and he was not a football man. He was a businessman, a Cleveland-based entrepreneur with interests in furniture and finance, who saw the professional game not as a sport, but as a speculative venture. In the anarchic ecosystem of the early NFL, Deutsch recognized a fundamental truth that the idealists and local patriots like Ralph Hay in Canton had missed. In a system with no rules protecting competitive balance or franchise integrity, the most efficient path to victory was not to build a team, but to buy one. And in 1924, he executed this logic with a ruthless clarity that would forever alter the trajectory of the league. His target was the champion Canton Bulldogs. His method was not to defeat them on the field, but to purchase them from the ledger book. His creation would be the Cleveland Bulldogs, a team born not from civic pride or gradual construction, but from a single, devastating act of corporate raiding. This was the pivotal act of predation. It was the moment the frontier anarchy of the league crystallized into a cold, recognizable business model, where a champion could be disassembled and its parts sold off, leaving only a hollow brand and a heartbroken city behind. Sam Deutsch's strategy was born from the very chaos that defined the league. He observed the player jumping, the financial instability, and the complete lack of territorial rights. He saw that a team's greatest asset, its roster, was essentially a collection of free agents held together by weekly paychecks and fleeting loyalty. Canton, despite its on-field dominance, was financially vulnerable. The costs of maintaining a championship-caliber roster were straining the modest revenue base of a small industrial city. Ralph Hay and his partners were not wealthy magnates. They were local businessmen for whom the Bulldogs were a passionate, but costly sideline. Deutsch, backed by a Cleveland syndicate, saw an opportunity. He understood that the value of the Canton Bulldogs as a football entity was separate from its value as a Canton institution. The former could be moved. The latter was worthless to him. In the winter following Canton's second championship in 1923, Deutsch made his move. He didn't approach the star players individually, though that would come. He went straight to the source. He negotiated with the Canton ownership group and purchased the entire franchise. The transaction included the team's name, its NFL membership, its schedule, and crucially, the rights to its players. The price was a reported $2,500. It was not an investment in the future of Canton football. It was an acquisition of assets. What followed was a clinical stripping of assets that would make any modern corporate raider nod in recognition. Deutsch immediately moved the franchise's operational heart to Cleveland. He took the championship roster, the core of players like player coach Guy Chamberlain, the formidable tackle Link Lyman, and other key contributors, and simply relocated them. These men were now the Cleveland Bulldogs. They wore new uniforms, played in a different stadium, and collected paychecks from a different bank. For them, it was a pragmatic decision. Deutsch likely offered financial security that the shaky Canton operation could no longer guarantee. The players' loyalty, forged in the Ohio League fires, was ultimately to their profession and their pay. The emotional tether to Canton snapped under the weight of a more stable offer. Meanwhile, what remained in Canton was the carcass. The NFL franchise rights had been sold, so the city no longer had an official team in the league. In a bizarre and cruel twist, local interests managed to secure a separate franchise for 1924, also called the Canton Bulldogs, but it was a ghost. It had no claim to the championship players, no institutional memory, and no soul. It was an expansion team in its own city, forced to start from absolute zero while watching the men who had built their legacy play under their stolen name just 60 miles away. The 1924 season unfolded as a perfect, brutal case study. The Cleveland Bulldogs, built with Canton's championship chassis, were immediately contenders. They would finish the season with a strong record, a testament to the enduring machine Guy Chamberlain had built. They were the legitimate continuation of the dynasty in everything but geography. Meanwhile, the new Canton Bulldogs were a pathetic facsimile. They scrambled to assemble a roster of cast-offs, local amateurs, and whoever was left after Deutsch's raid. Their results were disastrous. They became the laughingstock of the league, a constant, painful reminder of what had been taken. The fans in Canton, who had poured their civic pride into this team, were understandably confused and then embittered. They were being asked to support a shell, while the spirit of their champions was performing in another city. The emotional contract between team and community was shattered beyond repair. Attendance plummeted. Financial losses mounted. The championship aura of 1922 and 1923 now haunted the city, a phantom limb of glory that throbbed with every loss the new team suffered and every victory the Cleveland team achieved. This act of predation by Sam Deutsch was more than just a shrewd business gamble. It was a flash of lightning that illuminated the existential crisis facing the NFL. It demonstrated, in the starkest possible terms, that the league's current structure was a suicide pact. If a champion could be legally purchased and dismantled in the offseason, then no franchise was safe. Investment in player development, team cohesion, and fan loyalty was meaningless if a deeper-pocketed rival could simply buy your achievements out from under you. The raid exposed the fundamental flaw in the league's lack of central authority and its absence of basic protections for competitive balance. Deutsch didn't break any rules because there were no rules to break. He simply operated according to the ruthless logic of the environment the owners themselves had created. His move was the ultimate expression of the anarchic every man for himself ethos, and in its success, it sounded the death knell for that very era. The other owners, including powerful figures like George Halas in Chicago, watched this happen. They saw the chaos it created, the disillusionment it spawned in a key football market, and the precedent it set. They realized that if it could happen to Canton, it could happen to them. A league where such predation was possible was a league with no future. The fall of the Canton Bulldogs, engineered by Sam Deutsch's cold calculus, was the crisis that finally forced the warlords to the table. It was the traumatic event that proved they could no longer be just rivals. They had to become partners in a cartel, bound by rules that would protect them from each other, even if it meant sacrificing the independence that had defined their frontier existence. Deutsch, the predator, had inadvertently become the catalyst for order. But the cost of that new order was the complete and total sacrifice of the first dynasty, left to die on the altar of the league's survival. The 1924 Canton Bulldogs season was not a football campaign. It was a protracted funeral, a weekly ritual of humiliation where the corpse of a champion was paraded before a grieving town. Every Sunday became an exercise in cruel comparison. The real Bulldogs, the men who had forged the dynasty, were in Cleveland, wearing different colors but playing the same brutal, efficient football under Guy Chamberlain. They were the ghosts that haunted Canton. What took the field in Canton was a phantom, a collection of strangers wearing familiar sweaters, tasked with an impossible pantomime. They were not a team, they were a placeholder, a legal technicality fulfilling a schedule. The disaster that unfolded was financial, competitive, and deeply emotional. It was the final, convulsive stage of the franchise's death, a public autopsy that laid bare the total cost of the league's anarchic selfishness. This was the last stand, but there was no glory in it, only the slow, draining realization that something beloved had been murdered, and we were all being asked to applaud the empty shell it left behind. The practical challenges of assembling a team from nothing were insurmountable from the start. With the championship roster now belonging to Cleveland, the new Canton ownership, a separate group from the one that sold out, had to start from absolute zero. There was no draft, no free agency period, no farm system. They scoured the region for willing bodies. They signed local athletes from factory teams, college players whose eligibility had expired, and veterans whose best years were long behind them. The cohesion that had been Canton's trademark under Chamberlain was non-existent. These men had never played together. They had no shared language, no trust, no system. They were a pickup team thrust into the ring against professional outfits that had been building for years. The contrast was visceral and painful. The 1924 Canton Bulldogs season was not a football campaign. It was a protracted funeral, a weekly ritual of humiliation where the corpse of a champion was paraded before a grieving town. Every Sunday became an exercise in cruel comparison. The real Bulldogs, the men who had forged the dynasty, were in Cleveland, wearing different colors but playing the same brutal, efficient football under Guy Chamberlain. They were the ghosts that haunted Canton. What took the field in Canton was a phantom, a collection of strangers wearing familiar sweaters, tasked with an impossible pantomime. They were not a team, they were a placeholder, a legal technicality fulfilling a schedule. The disaster that unfolded was financial, competitive, and deeply emotional. It was the final, convulsive stage of the franchise's death, a public autopsy that laid bare the total cost of the league's anarchic selfishness. This was the last stand, but there was no glory in it, only the slow, draining realization that something beloved had been murdered, and we were all being asked to applaud the empty shell it left behind. The practical challenges of assembling a team from nothing were insurmountable from the start. With the championship roster now belonging to Cleveland, the new Canton ownership, a separate group from the one that sold out, had to start from absolute zero. There was no draft, no free agency period, no farm system. They scoured the region for willing bodies. They signed local athletes from factory teams, college players whose eligibility had expired, and veterans whose best years were long behind them. The cohesion that had been Canton's trademark under Chamberlain was non-existent. These men had never played together. They had no shared language, no trust, no system. They were a pickup team thrust into the ring against professional outfits that had been building for years. The contrast was visceral and painful. Where the 1922-23 Bulldogs executed with machine precision, the 1924 version fumbled with amateurish confusion. The blocking was uncoordinated. The defensive assignments were blown. The fundamental mechanics of the game, which Chamberlain had drilled into his men until they were instinct, were foreign concepts. They weren't just losing. They were being exposed week after week as fraudulent claimants to a legacy they had no part in building. The scores tell a story of unrelenting despair. They opened the season against the Columbus Tigers, a middling team, and were crushed 35-0. The following week, against the powerful Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, the humiliation deepened. A 37-0 defeat. The defense, once an immovable wall, was now a sieve. The offense, once a model of efficiency, could not cross midfield with any consistency. As the season ground on, the losses piled up in a monotonous rhythm of futility. They would manage a rare, close game like a 6-3 loss to Akron, offering a flicker of false hope, only to be plunged back into the abyss with defeats like 40-0 to the Green Bay Packers or 28-0 to the Chicago Bears. The team was not simply being defeated. It was being erased from the scoreboard. Every zero posted next to Canton in the newspaper was a stark, numerical confirmation of the theft that had occurred. The championship defense, renowned for its ferocity, had surrendered 158 points in just 11 games, an astronomical figure for the low-scoring era. They finished the season with a single victory, a 16-0 win over a similarly hapless Kenosha team. A pitiful footnote in a year of unmitigated disaster. That lone win felt less like a triumph and more like a grim mercy, a brief pause in the weekly punishment. The reaction from the fans in Canton was a complex stew of anger, heartbreak, and ultimately, abandonment. These were the same people who had packed the stands and roared for Chamberlain, Thorpe, and Lyman. They had invested their civic identity in those men and that team. Now, they were being asked to pay money to witness a travesty. The emotional betrayal was profound. They felt a dual loss. The loss of their heroes, who now played for the rival city of Cleveland, and the loss of their own pride. Attending a game at Lakeside Park became an act of masochism or morbid curiosity. The crowds dwindled from the thousands of the championship years to a few hundred loyalists and the idly curious. The atmosphere was funereal, punctuated not by cheers but by groans and the hollow silence of disbelief. The connection between team and town, the vital lifeblood of the Ohio League, was severed. The fans weren't just disappointed in a bad team. They were grieving the death of their champion and resenting the imposter that stood in its place. This disillusionment was fatal to the financial viability of the franchise. Football was a business run on gate receipts, and the gate was now empty. The financial hemorrhage was immediate and catastrophic. With attendance in freefall, the revenue needed to pay players, secure a stadium, and cover travel expenses evaporated. The new ownership group, having paid for the shell of a franchise, watched their investment dissolve week by week. The costs were fixed, but the income was vanishing. Every home game operated at a significant loss. Traveling to road games meant spending scarce cash with little hope of a meaningful share of the gate. The business model, always precarious, was now impossible. The Canton Bulldogs were bleeding money with every snap of the ball. By the end of the 1924 season, the franchise was financially insolvent. The ownership was ruined. The experiment of fielding a replacement team had proven to be a catastrophic failure, not due to lack of effort, but because the essential ingredient, the soul of the team, had been legally sold to the highest bidder. The hollowed-out brand could not survive. The league, which had allowed this situation to occur through its own lack of governance, now had a dead franchise on its hands in one of its founding cities. The champion had not just been defeated. It had been financially euthanized by the very market forces the league had unleashed. The final, symbolic death knell came with the fate of the name itself. After the 1924 season, the Cleveland Bulldogs, the team that was the spiritual and physical successor to Canton's Dynasty, were themselves disbanded by Sam Deutsch. He had extracted the value he wanted. The players scattered once more. The Cleveland experiment was over. But in Canton, there was no revival. The city was spent, financially and emotionally. The NFL franchise for Canton was left dormant, a ghost in the league's ledger. The once proud name was now associated only with disaster and theft. The last stand had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of a ledger book closing, of empty stands creaking in the wind, and of a community turning its attention elsewhere, its love for professional football replaced by a deep, enduring sense of betrayal. The field at Lakeside Park fell silent. The Bulldogs were gone. But the seismic shock of their collapse was just beginning to reverberate through the league offices. The utter disaster in Canton was the smoking gun, the irrefutable evidence that the current path led only to ruin. The chaos had consumed its finest creation. Now, the survivors would have to decide if they would continue to feast on each other, or if they would finally, belatedly, build something that could last. The silence that followed the Canton Bulldogs' collapse was not just the quiet of an empty stadium in Ohio. It was a deafening, oppressive silence that settled over the entire National Football League. It was the silence of a looming abyss. The owners, the rival warlords who had spent years in a state of cheerful predation, now stood at the edge of that abyss and peered in. They saw the reflected image of Canton's ruins. The financial wreckage, the scattered players, the disillusioned fans, the utter evaporation of a champion. And for the first time, a cold, collective fear took hold. This was no longer about weekly gate receipts or bidding for a star halfback. This was about extinction. The league's chaotic, every man for himself model had reached its logical, self-cannibalizing conclusion. If the system could destroy its best product, then the system itself was terminal. Into this vacuum of leadership and legitimacy stepped a man who was neither a star player nor a flamboyant owner. He was a sports editor from Columbus, Ohio, named Joseph Carr. His election as president of the NFL was not a celebration. It was an act of desperation. He was hired to be the coroner, to confirm the league's death, or to perform a radical, ruthless surgery to save it. Carr chose surgery. He understood that the patient could not survive without a skeleton, without a central nervous system. His mission was to impose order, and he would do it with the pragmatism of a mechanic, not the passion of a fan. He looked at the smoking wreckage of Canton and did not see a tragedy. He saw a blueprint. It was a blueprint of every single thing the league had been doing wrong. Carr was an unusual figure for this role. He was not a football man from the muddy fields of the Ohio League. He was a newspaper man. He had been the editor of the Ohio State Journal's sports page and had founded and managed the Columbus Panhandles, a team comprised largely of railroad workers, which he ran with notable organizational efficiency on a meager budget. This background was crucial. As a sports writer, he had observed the league's farcical instability from a critical, analytical distance. He saw the scheduling jokes, the financial panic, the comical player movement. As the owner of the Panhandles, he had felt those instabilities firsthand, struggling to compete with teams that could outspend him one week and vanish the next. He was, therefore, uniquely positioned to diagnose the illness. He understood the publicity side of the game and the brutal economics underneath it. He was a bureaucrat by temperament, a believer in systems, minutes, and ledgers. The anarchic, charismatic chaos that defined men like George Halas or the freewheeling spirit of the player jumpers was alien to him. He saw football not as a weekend spectacle but as a business that needed a business plan. The Canton disaster was the ultimate proof that his perspective was the only one that could prevent total collapse. His vision was not born of a dream to create a national sports institution. It was born of a simple, stark ultimatum: control or die. The league needed to be transformed from a loose confederation of independent contractors into a single corporate entity with enforceable rules. Carr's philosophy was fundamentally about risk mitigation. The old model placed all the risk on the individual franchise owner. The risk of a bad weather day, the risk of a rival raiding his roster, the risk of being stuck with a schedule of games that couldn't draw flies. Carr's new model would shift that risk. It would be shared, managed, and contained by the league office. The risk to the individual owner would be minimized, and in its place, a new risk would be introduced for anyone who challenged the league's authority. The risk to the individual owner would be minimized, and in its place, a new risk would be introduced for anyone who challenged the league's authority. His goal was to make franchise ownership a stable, profitable investment, and to do that, he had to make the league bigger than any one owner, any one player, or any one city. Canton had proven that a city, no matter how passionate, was an insufficient foundation. Carr would build a foundation of law. He started with a clear diagnosis, and the symptoms were all cataloged in Canton's corpse. First, the financial instability. A team's viability could not hinge on 1 week's gate receipts. This required longer-term planning and stability of operation. Second, the player rating. The very concept of a team was meaningless if its components could be purchased wholesale by a competitor. There had to be a recognized legal bond between a player and a franchise. Third, the scheduling and competitive anarchy. A league championship had to be uncontestable, decided on a fair and uniform field of play, not a haphazard collection of negotiated games. Fourth, the lack of territorial security. An owner needed to know that his investment in building a local fan base would not be undercut by a rival moving in next door or, as in Canton's case, moving his own team out. Each of these problems was interlinked, and Carr knew that solving one without the others was futile. He had to attack the entire structure simultaneously. Carr's method was not to seek consensus from the owners, but to present them with a survival pact. He used the fear generated by Canton's fall as his primary leverage. In league meetings, he would have been the calm, insistent voice pointing to the ledger books and the newspaper headlines. This is what happens, he would have argued. Asterisk, this is your future. You can continue to fight over the scraps until there are no scraps left, or you can agree to cook a larger meal together with rules for the table star. He appealed not to their love of the game, but to their self-interest as businessmen. The powerful owners like Halas in Chicago, who had the most to lose from restrictions, were likely skeptical. But even Halas could see the logic. The Bears might be strong today, but what was to stop a syndicate from New York or Philadelphia from buying the entire Bears roster tomorrow if the price was right? The Canton precedent made every owner feel vulnerable. Carr offered them protection from each other. He offered them a monopoly. His early actions were symbolic but significant. He moved the league's headquarters from the haphazard surroundings of Ralph Hayes' Canton Automobile showroom to a proper office in Columbus. This was a physical declaration of professional intent. He began to keep official records, to standardize communication, to act like the executive of a real business. But these were just preliminaries. He was drafting a new constitution, a set of bylaws that would rewrite the league's DNA. He was drawing a line in the sand, with the ashes of the Canton Bulldogs on one side, and his vision of a permanent, orderly league on the other. The process would be messy, and it would require confronting not only the owner's instincts for independence but also the entrenched culture of the players themselves. The freewheeling mercenary, the player jumper who was the hero of the anarchic age, was about to be declared an outlaw. The age of the itinerant football laborer was ending. The age of the league asset was about to begin. Joseph Carr, the quiet sports editor from Columbus, was not a sheriff chosen by a town. He was a general appointed by a council of terrified barons, given one mandate: secure the kingdom. And he knew that to do that, he would have to first tear up the old map and draw new borders that would forever enclose the players and the teams within the walls of the league's own design. The document was not dramatic in appearance. It was typed pages, clauses, and subclauses, the dry language of governance. But the 1925 Constitution and bylaws of the National Football League were the most revolutionary playbooks in the sport's history. They contained no diagrams for a new offensive formation or a trick play. Instead, they diagrammed a new reality. Joseph Carr, the quiet man from Columbus, understood that to save the league from the fate of Canton, he had to architect a system so fundamentally different that such a collapse could never happen again. He had to build walls where there were none. He had to create chains where only handshakes existed. This was not about improving football. This was about inventing a structure that could contain it, control it, and guarantee its survival as a business. Every single rule, every stilted paragraph, was a direct, surgical response to a specific failure that had led to the Bulldogs' disintegration. The Canton disaster was the question. The 1925 Constitution was Carr's brutal, brilliant answer. The first and most poignant wall he built was the rule of territorial rights. This was the most obvious lesson from the Sam Deutsch raid. The Constitution stated that the league now had exclusive control over franchise locations. No owner could simply move his team into another team's city. More importantly, the league defined a team's territory, typically a 75-mile radius, as its exclusive domain for games and fan support. The implications were profound. The era of the nomadic franchise or the predatory neighbor was over. A team's connection to its city was no longer a sentimental notion. It was a legally protected monopoly. This rule was Canton's tombstone and its memorial. It guaranteed that no future champion could be stolen from its community because the community was now an official asset of the franchise, protected by league law. The rule served the owners' interests perfectly. It stabilized their investments. It gave them a captive market. It turned civic pride from a volatile emotional fuel into a bankable, secure resource. But for the fans in Canton, it was a posthumous justice, a rule written because their heartbreak had proven the old way was untenable. Their city was now protected, but it was protected as a concept, a market segment in the league's business plan, long after their actual team had been carted away. The second and most transformative invention was the standard player contract. In the old anarchy, a player's relationship with a team was a verbal or scribbled weekly agreement. Carr replaced this with a uniform, binding legal document. The contract obligated the player to perform services exclusively for one club for the entire season. But its true power was hidden in its options and implications. It gave the club the exclusive right to that player's services for the following season, essentially binding the man to the team in perpetuity unless the team chose to release, trade, or sell his contract. This was the birth of the reserve clause in all but name. The player jumper, the freelance mercenary who had been the archetype of the early league, was now a contractual outlaw. His autonomy was extinguished. He was no longer an independent craftsman selling his labor on the open market each week. He was a piece of property, an asset on a team's balance sheet. This was the direct answer to the player rating that had hollowed out Canton. Deutsch couldn't buy the Canton roster now because those players wouldn't simply be free agents. They would be under contract, and those contracts would be owned by the Canton franchise. The system was designed to make the roster as a collective entity immovable. It prioritized the stability of the institution over the freedom of the individual. For the owners, this was salvation. It allowed them to invest in developing players without fear of immediate poaching. It created the possibility of long-term team building. For the players, it was a fundamental shift in status. They gained a measure of job security, but they surrendered all leverage and all freedom of movement. Their value was now determined and controlled by a single employer. The wild frontier of labor was being fenced in, and the fences were written in legal ink. The third pillar of Carr's blueprint was the concentration of power in the office of the league president, a power that would later be enshrined in the commissioner. The Constitution granted the president sweeping authority to enforce these new rules. He could levy fines. He could suspend players or owners. He could arbitrate disputes. He could approve or deny franchise shifts and new membership. This was the creation of a central nervous system with teeth. Before, the league was a committee with no executive power. Now, it had a chief executive. Carr made himself the judge, jury, and enforcer. This power was necessary to give the new rules meaning. A territorial rights rule is useless if there is no authority to punish someone who violates it. A standard contract is just paper if there is no penalty for breaking it. Carr ensured that defiance of the league's authority would become more costly than adherence to its rules. This centralized power was the final ingredient in the formula. It moved the ultimate risk from the individual owner to the individual player or maverick owner who might challenge the system. The risk of franchise failure was mitigated by territorial rights and stable rosters. The new risk was being cast out of the league itself. This power would be used decisively in the coming years, most famously in the 1925 controversy with the Pottsville Maroons, to demonstrate that the league's authority, not on-field results, was the final determinant of fate. Together, these three innovations formed an interlocking system of control. Territorial rights protected the market. The standard contract protected the inventory. Centralized power protected the rules. It was a closed loop. The league was no longer a public square where teams and players met. It was a walled garden, and Joseph Carr held the only key. The spirit of the reserve clause, that inherent bind of player to team, was the soul of this new system. It meant that the value created by a player, a Guy Chamberlain, a Jim Thorpe, would now be captured entirely by the franchise and, by extension, the league. The player could no longer auction that value to the highest weekly bidder. He was a generator of wealth, but the grid to which he was connected was owned by someone else. This was the true birth of the NFL as a modern sports entity. The colorful, chaotic years before 1925 were a prehistory. This was year one. The league had chosen survival over freedom, stability over excitement, control over chaos. It had looked at the vibrant, unpredictable, and ultimately self-destructive world that created the Canton Bulldogs and decided to smother it in the crib. The blueprint was flawless from a business perspective. It guaranteed the league's permanence. But it also established a foundational power dynamic that would define every conflict for the next century. The owners, protected from each other and gifted control of their labor, became partners in a cartel. The players, from stars to substitutes, became captive assets. Canton legacy was not just a memory of championships. It was the ghost that haunted every negotiation, every holdout, every labor war. The players were fighting not just for money, but to reclaim a sliver of the autonomy that the league, in its desperate scramble to avoid another Canton, had stripped from them forever. The walls were up. The gates were locked. The empire was secure. Now it had to prove it could enforce its own laws. The new laws were written, but paper is fragile. Authority is not proclaimed. It is proven. The ink on Joseph Carr's 1925 Constitution was barely dry when the National Football League faced its first and most defining test of will. It was not enough to have rules. The league had to demonstrate in brutal, unambiguous terms that it would enforce them, that the cost of defiance would be catastrophic. This period was not about gentle transition. It was about the deliberate public crushing of the old world's instincts. The player who thought he could still jump teams, the owner who believed a handshake deal or an on-field victory outweighed the league's decree. They had to be broken. The enforcement of Carr's blueprint was a campaign on two fronts: the silent, administrative war against player mobility, and the spectacular, public crucifixion of a team that challenged the new order. The target of that crucifixion was not a fading giant like Canton, but an upstart champion, the Pottsville Maroons. Their story is the moment the NFL shed its last skin of sporting romanticism and revealed the iron framework of a business empire beneath. It established for all time that the league's authority was absolute, and that its survival would always trump mere football justice. The suppression of player mobility was a quiet, bureaucratic purge. The standard contract was the tool, but its enforcement required a new kind of vigilance. The league office, now a functioning entity under Carr, began to monitor rosters, to track contracts, to act as a central clearinghouse. The player jumper, once the archetype of the freelance athlete, was now reclassified as a fugitive. If a player under contract with the Chicago Bears tried to suit up for the Green Bay Packers for a better payday, he wasn't just being disloyal. He was violating a league bylaw. The punishment could be suspension or outright banishment. This shifted the entire psychology of the labor force. The bidding wars didn't end immediately, but they were driven underground, forced into the realm of under-the-table promises and off-the-books bonuses, because the overt act of jumping was now a career-ending risk. More importantly, it established the principle of league-wide collusion on labor. The owners were no longer competitors for talent in an open market. They were partners in a cartel who agreed to respect each other's property rights. A player's value was no longer set by what the open market would bear, but by what his single, designated employer was willing to pay. This was the silent, daily enforcement of the reserve clause spirit. It happened not on roaring fields, but in office correspondence and closed-door meetings. It was the unglamorous work of building a monopoly, and it was devastatingly effective. The anarchic energy that had defined the early stars, the very energy that made Jim Thorpe a draw, was systematically being drained from the sport, replaced by a more manageable, if less vibrant, obedience. But the true spectacle of enforcement, the event that burned the new reality into the consciousness of every owner and fan, was the 1925 NFL Championship controversy involving the Pottsville Maroons. The Maroons were a powerhouse from Pennsylvania's coal country, a team of rugged, talented miners who played with a ferocity that mirrored their town. In 1925, they assembled a phenomenal roster and began bulldozing the league. Their claim to the championship seemed straightforward. They had the best record. They had beaten their rivals convincingly. But they existed in the messy transition between the old ways and Carr's new order. The league schedule was still somewhat irregular, and the concept of a strictly managed postseason was not fully formed. Seizing an opportunity for a major payday and prestige, the Maroons management scheduled an unauthorized exhibition game in Philadelphia against a team of Notre Dame All-Stars. This game was to be played in Frankfurt's territory, a direct violation of the new territorial rights rule Carr had instituted specifically to prevent such incursions. The Maroons saw it as a bold business move, a chance to prove their mettle against college football's best and reap a financial windfall. The league, under Carr, saw it as an existential rebellion. Here was a team, particularly one from a small, hardscrabble town much like Canton, daring to prioritize its own revenue and reputation over the sanctity of the league's rules. Carr reacted with stunning severity. He didn't fine them. He didn't reprimand them. After the Maroons played and won the Notre Dame game, Carr suspended the franchise. He revoked their right to play any more games, effectively ending their season. Then, in a move of breathtaking bureaucratic finality, he convened the league's executive committee, dominated by owners from bigger cities like Chicago and New York, and they voted to strip Pottsville of the championship title, awarding it instead to the Chicago Cardinals, a team with a lesser claim based on a disputed game and technicalities. The message was not subtle. It was a thunderclap. The Pottsville Maroons had done the football equivalent of winning every battle on the field. But they had lost the war in the league office. Carr's decision proved that the NFL was no longer a sporting competition that also had some rules. It was a governance structure that permitted a sporting competition within its strict limits. The authority of the league office was now the ultimate referee, and its calls were not subject to appeal based on merit or fairness. The Pottsville Maroons rule became an unspoken but understood precedent. Challenge the league's control over scheduling, territory, or its own narrative, and you would be annihilated, your achievements erased from the official record. This was the ghost of Canton's lesson, applied with cold precision. Canton had fallen because the league lacked the power to stop a predator. Pottsville was crushed because the league now had the power to stop anyone, even a champion, from acting independently. The difference was the blueprint. Carr had built the guillotine, and Pottsville provided the neck. The aftermath was a masterpiece of established power. The Maroons and their fans protested for decades, rightfully arguing they were the best team on the field. But it didn't matter. The league never reversed its decision. The Cardinals were the champions in the record books. The lesson was absorbed by every other franchise owner. Your success, your very identity as a football team, was a privilege granted by the league, not a right earned solely between the lines. You could be a champion one week and a non-entity the next if you violated the central authority. This enforcement solidified the owners' cartel. It made them understand that their individual ambitions were now secondary to the collective health and authority of the monopoly. They had traded their wild independence for security, and Pottsville was the bloody sacrifice that sealed that pact. By the end of the 1920s, the enforcement of Carr's blueprint was complete. The player was bound. The owner was subdued. The champion was whoever the league said it was. The chaotic, passionate, unstable world that had birthed the Canton Bulldogs was gone, paved over by the smooth, hard concrete of administrative control. The NFL had saved itself from the fate of Canton by becoming something entirely different. Something more powerful, more permanent, and far less free. The enforcers had won. The frontier was closed. The corporation was now in charge. And the first item on its new agenda was dealing with the human capital now firmly under its control, the labor force that had just been stripped of its last vestiges of power. The age of the player jumper was over. The age of the organized player, fighting not for weekly pay but for fundamental rights within a rigged system, was about to begin. The silence that followed the enforcement of the new order was not the silence of compliance. It was the silence of calculation, of men realizing the ground had shifted irrevocably beneath their feet. The players, the men whose bodies and talents were the league's only true product, had watched the old freelance world evaporate. The open market for their labor was gone, replaced by a single monopsonistic buyer, their team operating under the league's strict cartel rules. They had been transformed, almost overnight, from independent contractors into de facto serfs, bound to their franchise by the standard contract. The thrill of the weekly auction was over. The power to leverage a better offer from a rival town was extinct. In its place was a simple, stark reality. Take what you are given or do not play professional football. This seismic shift did not go unanswered. From this new serfdom, the first stirrings of organized labor were born. They were not the sophisticated unions of later decades. They were desperate, fleeting grasps at collective power, born in hotel rooms and speakeasies, and they were doomed from the start. They were attempts to build a life raft while locked in the hold of a ship that had already decided their fate. And in the figure of Red Grange, the Illinois sensation who turned professional in a blaze of national glory, we see the entire paradox of player power in its infancy. The most famous athlete in America could stage a spectacular, lucrative rebellion against the system, only to prove, in the end, that the system was designed to absorb all rebellions one way or another. The first attempts at organization were fragmented and inherently weak. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, players on various teams, feeling the pinch of the Depression and the tight fist of owners who now had total control over salaries, began to whisper about collective action. There were murmurs of a players' union, even a few scattered meetings. But the obstacles were insurmountable. The reserve clause and standard contract made each man utterly replaceable. To speak of organization was to risk being blackballed, labeled a troublemaker in a league with no other employers. Their careers were short, their financial reserves minimal. They lacked a stable, year-round community. They were seasonal workers scattered across the country in the off-season. They had no pension, no health care, no guarantee beyond this week's paycheck, which made the risk of standing up catastrophic. Furthermore, the league and owners masterfully cultivated a culture of individualism and gratitude. Playing professional football was portrayed as a privilege, a dream. To complain about the terms was to be ungrateful for the chance to play a boys' game for money. This cultural pressure was a powerful tool against collective thinking. The early organizing efforts were less like a union drive and more like a secret society of the disgruntled, unable to gain any public traction or muster the collective courage to strike. They were trying to bargain from a position of absolute weakness, and the owners, unified by Carr's cartel, held all the leverage. Into this subdued landscape exploded the phenomenon of Red Grange. His decision to turn professional with the Chicago Bears in 1925, immediately after his final collegiate game, was a seismic media event. He was not just a player, he was a national celebrity of a magnitude the NFL had never seen. And for a brief, dazzling moment, it appeared Grange and his brilliant agent C.C. Pyle had cracked the code. They understood that Grange's value was not as a Bears employee, but as a standalone entertainment property. The Bears contract was just the beginning. Pyle orchestrated a mammoth, coast-to-coast barnstorming tour following the 1925 season. Grange and a squad of all-stars, including many Bears teammates, would travel the country, playing a grueling series of exhibition games against local teams and NFL clubs outside of official league schedules. They were a traveling circus, and Grange was the ringmaster. The tour was a sensation, drawing massive crowds and generating astronomical revenue, most of which flowed to Grange and Pyle, not to the Bears or the NFL. This barnstorming tour was, in essence, a spectacular rebellion against the very system Carr had built. It was a throwback to the anarchic, player-centric days of Jim Thorpe, but on a vastly more lucrative scale. Grange was acting as his own franchise. He was jumping markets, ignoring territorial rights, and creating his own schedule. He was proving that the true economic power resided in the star player, not the league structure. For a moment, it seemed the owner's cartel might be helpless against the power of transcendent celebrity. Grange was not a serf. He was a king, and the league's rules seemed not to apply to him. His tour was a beacon to every player, a demonstration that there was another way, a path to wealth and independence that bypassed the owner's ledger entirely. But the NFL system, engineered for survival above all, possessed a brilliant, absorptive capacity. The owners and Carr watched Grange's tour not with panic, but with cold calculation. They saw the crowds and counted the money. They understood that Grange's rebellion, if left unchecked, could create a precedent. If one star could do this, why not others? The solution was not to crush Grange. He was too popular, too valuable. The solution was to co-opt him, to bend his rebellion back into the system. When Pyle, emboldened by the tour's success, demanded an NFL franchise for himself in New York City for Grange to play for, the owners closed ranks. They refused. They would not allow an agent to become a peer, to introduce a virus of player-centric power into their ownership. A compromise was eventually struck, leading to Grange playing for a new franchise, the New York Yankees, but the control remained with traditional ownership. The true end of the rebellion was more subtle. The brutal physical toll of the barnstorming tour, playing nearly 20 extra games in a few months on top of an NFL season, took a catastrophic toll on Grange's body. He suffered a severe knee injury in 1927 that permanently diminished his otherworldly abilities. The independent, tour-based model was unsustainable because it consumed the very asset it relied upon. The league's model, in contrast, was designed for longevity, not of the player's body but of the institution. By the time Grange returned to the Bears, he was still a star, but he was a diminished one, and he was fully reintegrated into the league structure. His great rebellion had proven that even the most powerful player could not maintain a parallel football economy. The system could outlast you. It could wait for your knees to give out, for your fame to wane, and then welcome you back on its own terms. The lesson of the Grange saga was absorbed by players and owners alike. For owners, it confirmed that their control of the infrastructure, the franchises, the schedules, the official championship was the ultimate power. A star could make a lot of money on the edges, but he could not replace the core machine. For players, the lesson was bitterly dualistic. On one hand, it showed that monumental individual fame could create temporary leverage. On the other, it proved that the system was resilient, patient, and designed to ultimately channel all value, even rebellious value, back into the league's coffers. Grange's tour was the last, glorious flare of the individualist era. Its dimming left the players in a darker, more consolidated reality. Their attempts at collective organization had failed due to weakness and fear. Their hope for individual rebellion had flamed out in the exhausting, injurious grind of the road. They were left with the original, unyielding fact of Carr's blueprint. They were assets, bound and controlled. The labor was born, but it was born into captivity. The long, patient work of building true collective power, of organizing not around a single star's fame but around the shared vulnerability of every man on the roster, would be the work of decades. The first, faint cries for a union had been muffled. The next time they were heard, they would not be cries, but a roar, and they would come from the battlefield of a world war, where men learned the price of sacrifice and the meaning of collective bargaining in blood. The blueprint drafted in the wake of Canton's collapse was not a static document. It was a living doctrine, a strategic framework that would be pulled from the shelf and meticulously applied to every existential threat the NFL faced for the next half-century. Joseph Carr and the owners of the 1920s had not just solved their immediate crisis. They had authored a perpetual playbook for survival and domination. The core principles were immutable. Protect the territorial monopoly, control the labor, and centralize all authority to manage any challenge. As new technologies emerged and new rivals dared to enter the field, the league's response was never to innovate from a place of passion, but to control from a position of calculated power. The model born from Canton's fall would be refined through two major crucibles: the advent of television and the wars with rival leagues. In each case, the NFL's instinct was not to embrace the chaos of competition, but to impose the order of a cartel, to absorb the threat, and to emerge with its centralized control not just intact, but magnified. The ghost of Sam Deutsch's raid was exorcised by ensuring that no external force could ever again pick apart the league's assets. Instead, the league would do the picking. The first great test of the refined machine came not from a rival owner, but from a revolutionary technology: television. In the early 1950s, TV threatened to unravel the league's foundational control over its product's distribution and, by extension, its financial model. The initial fear was straightforward. If fans could watch games for free in their living rooms, why would they buy tickets and brave the elements to attend in person? The gate receipt was still the league's lifeblood. The anarchic response might have been to let every team make its own deals, to create a wild west of broadcast rights that would enrich a few big market clubs and bankrupt the rest, recreating the very instability that had doomed Canton. But the NFL, guided now by Commissioner Bert Bell, reached back to the Canton playbook. The solution was not to resist television, but to control it with an iron fist. In 1953, the league instituted the television blackout rule. No home game could be televised within a 75-mile radius of the home team's stadium. This was territorial rights reimagined for the electronic age. It legally enforced the local monopoly, protecting the gate by making attendance the only way to see your home team. It was a brutally simple application of the old principle: protect the franchise's exclusive domain at all costs. But control went further. The league, understanding that a fractured broadcast market would weaken it, also pioneered the concept of pooled television revenue. Instead of letting the New York Giants or Los Angeles Rams strike colossal independent deals while the Green Bay Packers scraped by, the NFL negotiated a single, national television contract and split the money equally among all teams. This was the financial equivalent of the standard player contract. It bound the franchises together, making them partners in a shared revenue stream. It eliminated the possibility of a wealthy, TV-rich team becoming a predator, raiding the rosters of smaller clubs, a direct echo of the Cleveland Syndicate's raid on Canton. The blackout protected the local monopoly. Revenue sharing protected the competitive balance and the cartel's unity. Television, which could have been a disruptive, democratizing force, was instead harnessed and channeled to reinforce the league's centralized power. The machine had successfully digested its first major technological revolution by applying the old rules to the new reality. The next great threat was more familiar: rival leagues. The All-America Football Conference, AAFC, launched in 1946, and the American Football League, AFL, followed in 1960. These were not just competing businesses. They were challenges to the NFL's monopoly status, its territorial claims, and its control over labor. The AAFC, with its flashy offenses and major market teams like the Cleveland Browns and San Francisco 49ers, directly challenged the NFL's claim to be the sole purveyor of major professional football. The war was costly for both sides, a drain on talent and treasury. The NFL's response, however, was not to try and crush the AAFC through pure competition alone. It fought on the field and at the box office, but its endgame was absorption. In 1950, after 4 years of conflict, the NFL agreed to a merger, but on its own terms. It took only 3 of the AAFC's teams: the Cleveland Browns, the San Francisco 49ers, and the Baltimore Colts. The other AAFC franchises were dissolved, their players dispersed through a draft. The NFL had eliminated a rival, strengthened its own roster with the AAFC's best assets, like the phenomenal Browns, and expanded its geographic footprint, all while maintaining its existing power structure. The Predators were not raiding the NFL. The NFL was now the apex predator, consuming its competition. The AFL war of the 1960s was a more protracted and expensive conflict, but the pattern was identical. The AFL, led by visionary owners like Lamar Hunt and armed with a lucrative television deal of its own, posed a significant threat. It competed fiercely for college talent, driving up player salaries. It placed teams in key NFL cities like New York and later Boston, challenging territorial rights. For years, the NFL fought with everything it had, including attempting to plant its own expansion team in AFL cities. But the ultimate solution, reached in 1966, was, again, absorption through merger. The AFL agreed to become part of the NFL, but the terms were a masterclass in controlled expansion. The two leagues would merge into a single entity with 2 conferences, culminating in a championship game, the Super Bowl. The NFL accepted the AFL's existence, but it folded the upstart league into its own administrative and governance structure. The older league's rules, its commissioner's authority, and its fundamental business model remained intact. The merger didn't create a new league. It allowed the NFL to swallow a rival whole, gaining its markets, its stars, and its television audience, while simultaneously ending the costly bidding war for players. The AFL's rebellion was neutralized by making its leaders partners in the very cartel they had sought to challenge. In each of these crises, the NFL acted not with the creativity of a sports league, but with the ruthless consistency of a sovereign state protecting its borders. The responses, the blackout rule, revenue sharing, and the absorption of rivals, were all logical extensions of the 1925 Canton Doctrine. Protect the territory. Stabilize the financial base. Centralize authority. Eliminate external competition by making it internal, and thus controllable. The machine refined itself not through innovation for the sake of the game, but through consolidation for the sake of power. The lesson of Canton had been learned too well. The league would never again allow a situation where an external force could pick off its champions or destabilize its economics. It would instead become the only force that mattered, the gravitational center that pulled all competition, all talent, and all revenue into its orbit. The model born from a small town's heartbreak in 1924 had become the operating system for a national entertainment monopoly. And as the empire grew, its next challenge would be to manage the internal pressures of that growth, to formalize the financial order that would keep the owners, now richer and more powerful than ever, united against their only remaining common foe, the players they owned. The financial architecture of the modern NFL is often described as a model of socialist utopia among owners. It is hailed as the genius mechanism that ensures competitive balance, that allows the small market Green Bay Packers to compete with the big city New York Giants. And in a sense, that is true. But to view revenue sharing as an act of altruism or pure sporting idealism is to misunderstand its origins and its purpose entirely. This financial order was the final, perfected layer of the control system born from the Canton crisis. Its primary objective was never to create fairness on the field for the sake of the fans. It was to create permanence and unity among the ownership cartel. It was designed to eliminate, once and for all, the financial instability and predatory imbalance that had led to the raid and collapse of the Bulldogs. Revenue sharing among owners was the ultimate safeguard against their own destructive instincts. It made them partners in a single, unimaginably lucrative enterprise. But this collectivism stopped abruptly at the owner's suite door. The partnership explicitly excluded the players. The labor was the cost, not a partner. And the subsequent history of collective bargaining would not be a negotiation between equals, but a long, managed war of attrition where the league's primary goal was to protect this foundational financial order, to defend the control established by Joseph Carr in 1925 against the only internal force that could challenge it, the unified will of the men who played the game. The principle of revenue sharing, particularly from national television contracts, was the logical evolution of the territorial rights rule. Territorial rights prevented one owner from stealing another's market. Revenue sharing prevented one owner from leveraging his market's inherent size to steal another's players. Before sharing, a team in New York, with its vast local television and ticket revenue, could have outspent a team like Green Bay for every free agent, recreating the very predatory imbalance that allowed Cleveland to strip Canton. By pooling the massive, league-negotiated TV money and splitting it evenly, the NFL engineered artificial parity. It made every franchise, regardless of location, a financially viable entity. This stability was the antidote to the existential fear Canton's fate had instilled. An owner no longer had to worry that a few bad weather days or a losing season would bankrupt his operation. His franchise value was now guaranteed by the league's collective television deal, a deal that grew exponentially with each renewal. This transformed team ownership from a risky, passion-driven business into a license to print money. It cemented the owners as a unified class, their interests perfectly aligned in growing the league's total revenue pie. They were no longer rival warlords. They were shareholders in NFL Incorporated. Disagreements became boardroom squabbles, not existential raids. The financial order had successfully tamed the owners. Now it had to manage the players. This is where the concept of collective bargaining entered, not as a natural right of labor, but as a necessary concession to be managed. The players, seeing the billions generated by their labor, began to organize in earnest. The NFL Players Association, formed in 1956, gained real traction in the 1960s and 70s. But from the league's perspective, collective bargaining was never about sharing power or revenue as partners. It was a pressure valve, a controlled mechanism for dispensing the minimum necessary to maintain the system's stability. The owners' unified front, forged by revenue sharing, gave them a colossal advantage at the negotiating table. They could afford to lock out players to endure lost games because their shared wealth provided a nearly infinite war chest. The players, with short careers and limited individual savings, could not. Every negotiation followed a brutal pattern. The players would demand a greater share of revenue, free agency, and better benefits. The owners would resist with all their might, offering minimal concessions. There would be strikes like in 1982 and 1987, and legal challenges. The league would eventually yield, but only on terms that protected the core of the Carr blueprint. The landmark moments in this managed war reveal the pattern. In 1977, the players won the right to free agency in court, only to see the owners immediately implement the Roselle Rule, which forced a team signing a free agent to pay crippling compensation to the player's former club, effectively freezing the market. This was the standard contract's vengeful ghost, ensuring control over movement. In 1993, true free agency finally arrived alongside a hard salary cap, following a monumental legal settlement and a new collective bargaining agreement. This is touted as a victory for players, and it was. But from the league's perspective, it was a masterstroke of controlled release. The salary cap was not a limit on owners' spending. It was a direct, mandatory link to a fixed percentage of defined league revenue. It institutionalized the player's share. It brought labor costs under predictable control. And it was paired with revenue sharing among owners, so the cap burden was sustainable for even the smallest market. This was the system perfecting itself. It gave players financial rewards and some mobility, but within a rigidly controlled economic framework that prevented any single team from spending its way to dominance or any player from truly destabilizing the cost structure. Free agency, the very concept the reserve clause was invented to prevent, was now allowed, but only in a league where the financial playing field was so artificially leveled that its impact could be absorbed without threat to the cartel's health. Free agency, the very concept the reserve clause was invented to prevent, was now allowed, but only in a league where the financial playing field was so artificially leveled that its impact could be absorbed without threat to the cartel's health. The core of Joseph Carr's vision, the binding of the player to the system's control, remained intact. The player was no longer bound to a single team forever by the reserve clause, but he was now bound to a league-wide system of compensation limits and defined revenue slices. His value was still determined by a collective agreement, not a true open market. The owners had traded absolute control over the individual for absolute control over the labor cost aggregate. The financial order ensured that no matter how high player salaries rose, they rose as a controlled percentage of a total pie that the owners, through their monopolistic control of the sport, guaranteed would keep growing. The players got a bigger piece, but the owners guaranteed an ever larger pie, and more importantly, they maintained control over the knife. This is the ultimate refinement of the model born from Canton's ashes. The chaos of the 1920s, the player jumping, the franchise instability, the predatory raids, has been eliminated not by embracing freedom, but by constructing a perfectly regulated marketplace. Revenue sharing tamed the owners. The salary cap and collectively bargained revenue percentage tamed the players' economic demands. The system is designed to be frictionless, conflict-averse, and perpetually profitable. It has made millionaires of players and billionaires of owners. But it has done so by ensuring that no individual, whether an owner like Sam Deutsch or a player like Red Grange, can ever again threaten the whole. The league office, Carr's central authority, now administers this vast financial engine, enforcing the cap, distributing the shared revenue, and negotiating the managed concessions of the CBA. The financial order is the fortress wall, and every collective bargaining agreement is just a renegotiation of the gate toll. The fortress itself, its foundations poured with the rubble of the Canton Bulldogs, remains unassailable. And as the money grew into the billions, the league faced a new task. Not just controlling the present and the future, but rehabilitating the past. It needed to soften the hard edges of its origin story, to turn the cautionary tale of Canton into a sentimental fable. It needed to build a temple where the ghosts of its ruthless birth could be worshipped, not feared. There is a profound and necessary distance between the place where something happened and the place where it is remembered. The ground of history is often bloody, chaotic, and marked by failure. The monument built upon it is serene, ordered, and dedicated to triumph. This distance is not an accident. It is the essence of myth-making. And no institution understands this alchemy better than the National Football League. In 1963, the league made a decision of immense symbolic weight. It selected the site for its Pro Football Hall of Fame. The choice was not New York, the media capital, or Chicago, the home of its oldest franchise. It chose Canton, Ohio. On the surface, it was a nod to origins, a sentimental return to roots. But beneath that gracious gesture lay an act of profound historical revisionism. The league was not honoring Canton for what it was, the grim proving ground where the sport's brutal, exploitative, and unstable nature nearly consumed itself. It was sanctifying Canton for what the league needed it to symbolize: a pure, humble beginning. The Hall of Fame would become a cathedral of legacy, a pilgrimage site where the complex, often painful story of professional football's birth could be smoothed into a gleaming narrative of progress and destiny. The founding of the Hall in Canton is the ultimate act of curation, a way to control the past by building a beautiful museum on top of the unmarked grave of the actual Canton Bulldogs. To walk through the Hall of Fame today is to experience a meticulously crafted origin story. The exhibits speak of pioneers and trailblazers. The busts of the enshrined gaze out with a solemn nobility. The narrative arc is one of inevitable growth, from scrappy town teams to a global sports empire. The violence of the early game is acknowledged, but as a testament to toughness, not as a symptom of a dangerously unregulated business. The violence of the early game is acknowledged, but as a testament to toughness, not as a symptom of a dangerously unregulated business. The financial desperation, the player exploitation, the franchise betrayals, these are not the stuff of gleaming glass cases. Jim Thorpe is there, of course. His tragic post-career struggles softened into a tale of misunderstood legend. The Cleveland Bulldogs championship of 1924 might be noted, but the mechanism of that championship, the purchase and evisceration of the Canton franchise, is not a centerpiece exhibit. The 1925 Pottsville Maroons controversy is perhaps mentioned as an oddity, not as the foundational lesson in league authoritarianism that it was. The Hall presents history as a curated collection of artifacts, not as a causal chain of ruthless decisions. It turns chaos into chronology. It transforms the predatory raid by Sam Deutsch into a simple line on a timeline. Franchise move to Cleveland. In this sacred space, the fall of the Bulldogs is not a catastrophic systemic failure. It is a minor plot point on the way to a better, more organized future. This is not to say the Hall of Fame is a lie. It is a monument to forgetting. It chooses what to remember and, more importantly, how to remember it. By placing this museum in Canton, the league performs a magic trick. It redirects the pilgrim's emotional energy. Instead of reflecting on the fact that this city's team was the first to be murdered by the league's own lack of governance, the visitor is encouraged to feel a warm nostalgia for the birthplace. The actual experience of Canton, the pride, the theft, the humiliation, the financial ruin, is submerged. In its place is a generic small-town American nostalgia, a sense of look how far we've come. The Hall's location is a permanent apology that never has to speak the crime aloud. It says, "We started here," and in doing so, it subtly implies a continuity and a gratitude that the historical record utterly refutes. It says, "We started here," and in doing so, it subtly implies a continuity and a gratitude that the historical record utterly refutes. Canton was not a cherished parent. It was a test subject, and it did not survive the experiment. The selection of Canton also served a crucial pragmatic purpose for the league's present and future. By the early 1960s, the NFL was locked in its war with the AFL. It was crafting a modern, television-friendly image. It needed a patina of tradition, a deep history to contrast with the AFL's upstart status. What better way to claim the mantle of legitimacy than to anoint an official birthplace and build a hallowed hall there? It was a public relations masterstroke. It gave players a tangible, emotional goal beyond money: immortality in Canton. It gave fans a mecca. It gave the league a heritage. This manufactured tradition was a weapon in the competitive war and a tool for internal cohesion. Enshrinement became the ultimate carrot, a way to bond legends to the league's narrative long after their playing days were over. It encouraged them to be grateful alumni, not critical former employees. The Hall of Fame, in essence, became the final, gentlest piece of the control apparatus, where the standard contract bound the player's present and the collective bargaining agreement managed his active career. The Hall of Fame sought to capture his eternal legacy for the league's benefit. The ceremony itself is a ritual of absorption. The gold jackets, the tears, the speeches thanking the game. It is powerfully moving and genuinely felt. But it also serves to seamlessly integrate even the most rebellious or tragic figures into the league's approved saga. A player who fought the owners in court, who held out for better pay, who criticized the commissioner, once enshrined, He is draped in the same gold fabric as the most company-loyal star. His descent is softened into fire or passion. His struggles are framed as personal obstacles overcome on the journey to the podium. The complex, often adversarial relationship between labor and management is smoothed into a grand, unified love of the game. The Hall of Fame ceremony is where the NFL's historical contradictions go to be resolved, not through analysis, but through celebration. It is the rewriting of history in real time, with the subject's grateful participation. For the city of Canton itself, the Hall of Fame is a bittersheim. It provides an economic engine and a point of pride that the actual Bulldogs franchise, in its dying days, never could. But it also forever chains the city's identity to a sanitized version of its own past. Canton is celebrated not for what it endured, but for a symbolic role it was assigned decades after the fact. The real history, the championship parades, the bitter fan betrayal, the empty stadium, is local lore, overshadowed by the national monument that now defines the town. The league, in a final act of irony, has given Canton a form of prosperity, but it is a prosperity built on the careful management of the town's own traumatic football memory. The graveyard has been paved over and turned into a tourist attraction. This myth-making is not a side project. It is central to the NFL's power. A league with an uncomfortable, ruthless origin story needs a shrine to transform that story into something palatable, even inspiring. The Hall of Fame in Canton allows every modern controversy, every labor dispute, every health crisis, every social justice protest, to be framed as a temporary challenge to a timeless, noble institution. It roots the present-day corporate behemoth in the sentimental soil of a simpler time. It creates an unbroken line from Jim Thorpe to Tom Brady, obscuring the fact that the line was drawn in a boardroom, not on a field. By controlling the past, the league fortifies its present. The Hall of Fame is the soft power counterpart to the hard power financial order. One controls the money, the other controls the story. And both were built from the same blueprint, drafted the moment the league realized that to survive the fallout of Canton, it would need to own not just its future, but its past. Having built this impeccable edifice of memory, the league would now face its most difficult task, applying the cold lessons of its past to the volatile human crises of its present, proving that the system could manage not just money and markets, but morality itself. The past is not a foreign country. It is a training ground, playbook. The systemic responses forged in the fire of the Canton disaster were not one-time fixes. They became the NFL's institutional DNA, a coded set of reflexes that activate whenever the league faces a threat to its stability, its control, or its narrative. We have followed the blueprint from its drafting in the 1920s through its application in financial and territorial wars. But the true testament to its power is how seamlessly it translates to the morally complex, publicly scrutinized battles of the modern era. The same core principles, centralize authority, manage the settlement, protect the owner's sovereignty, and enforce a unified message, are not relics. They are the operating system. When we examine the league's handling of the concussion crisis, player protests, and franchise relocation, we are not looking at new strategies. We are witnessing the eternal cycle. We are seeing the ghost of Canton and the specter of Pottsville reassert themselves, dressed in modern legal briefings and public relations campaigns. The stadiums are bigger, the money is incomprehensible, but the foundational impulses, carved from the rubble of the Bulldogs, remain unchanged. The concussion litigation presented the NFL with its most profound existential threat since the AFL wars. This was not a rival league. It was a scientific and moral reckoning that struck at the very product's core. The emerging research on CTE suggested the game itself, the source of all the wealth and glory, carried a latent, fatal cost. The league's initial response was a perfect echo of the 1925 playbook. Deny, discredit, and centralize the defense. Just as the early NFL dismissed the instability of its model until Canton collapsed, the modern league dismissed the link between football and brain trauma. It funded its own research, creating a semblance of scientific authority to counter independent studies, mirroring the way Carr created a central authority to counter the chaos of independent owners. But as the evidence mounted and the lawsuits from thousands of former players, consolidated into a single, massive class action. The league faced its Canton moment. A full admission of guilt and liability could have bankrupted the league, or at least forced a revolutionary, and perhaps impossible, change to the game's fundamental violence. The solution was not truth and reconciliation. It was a masterclass in managed settlement. The 2013 agreement, worth nearly $1 billion on paper, was not an admission of fault. It was a financial mechanism designed to cap liability, to create a predictable cost for the problem, and to make the existential threat into a manageable line item. This is the direct descendant of revenue sharing and the salary cap. It is about transforming an uncontrollable risk in the 1920s franchise failure, in the 2010s catastrophic litigation, into a controlled, budgeted expense. The settlement created a claims process, a bureaucracy that would adjudicate each injured former player's case, often pitting desperate men against a labyrinthine legal and medical gauntlet. The goal was not to make every victim whole, but to settle the issue for the league as a whole, to ensure the institution's survival and continued profit. The parallels are chilling. Canton was sacrificed for the league's survival. The health claims of generations of players were, in essence, compartmentalized and settled for the same reason. The league's authority and economic model were protected, while the individual, whether a 1920s champion or a 2000s lineman, remained negotiable, their suffering processed through a system designed above all for institutional permanence. The player protest movement, beginning with Colin Kaepernick taking a knee during the national anthem in 2016, presented a different kind of threat. It was not a financial or legal challenge. It was a challenge to the league's controlled narrative and its lucrative, apolitical brand. The NFL sells a precise product: violent, patriotic, unifying entertainment. A player using the game as a platform for social justice critique, particularly of the state, introduced a chaotic element the league's systems are built to suppress. The initial, floundering response from Commissioner Roger Goodell demonstrated the tension, but the eventual crackdown was pure Pottsville Maroons. The league did not engage with the substance of the protests. It focused exclusively on the act of protest itself as a violation of league protocol, a breach of the uniform of game day conduct. Just as the Pottsville Maroons were punished not for being unworthy champions, but for violating the league's territorial rule, players who knelt were treated as violators of a code. The policy demanding players stand or remain in the locker room was about reasserting centralized message control. It was a decree that the league's product, the spectacle of the game, would not be hijacked by individual conscience. This enforcement of uniformity is the cultural offspring of the standard player contract. That contract bound a player's labor to the team. The anthem policy sought to bind his public expression to the league's brand interests. The blacklisting of Colin Kaepernick, the effective collusion that kept him off a roster, was the ultimate enforcement. It sent a message more powerful than any fine. Challenge the league's controlled environment, and you will be exiled. Your talent is irrelevant. Your cause is irrelevant. The system's need for order and marketable harmony is paramount. Kaepernick became the 21st century's Pottsville Maroons, a contender erased from the official record for defying the authority of the league office. The NFL absorbed the energy of the social justice movement later, with superficial slogans on helmets and end zones, only after it could control the messaging and commodify the sentiment, turning rebellion into a league-sanctioned campaign. It was absorption, not acceptance. Franchise relocation is the most literal and brutal modern enactment of the original Canton blueprint. The rules have changed, but the foundational power dynamic has not. The Territorial Rights Rule of 1925 was created to protect owners from each other, not to protect cities from owners. That distinction is everything. When an owner like Stan Kroenke moves the St. Louis Rams to Los Angeles, or when a group moves the Oakland Raiders to Las Vegas, they are exercising the ultimate sovereignty granted to them by the league structure. The process is a grim pantomime of community negotiation, but the outcome is preordained by the financial calculus of the owner and the voting consent of his peers. The league office, CAR's central authority, facilitates the move, levying a nominal relocation fee that is then shared among the other owners. This is revenue sharing in action, but it is also blood money. It makes every owner complicit and financially invested in the betrayal of another city's fans. The emotional arc for fans in St. Louis or Oakland is identical to that of Canton in 1924. A deep sense of personal and civic betrayal, a feeling that something they built and loved has been coldly stolen by a distant financial power. The owner's claim of needing a new stadium is the modern equivalent of Sam Deutsch's claim of needing a larger market. The community's passion is weighed against a spreadsheet and found wanting. The NFL's relocation policies formalize the raid. They ensure it is not chaotic, but orderly and profitable for the cartel. The message is clear. A franchise is not a community trust. It is a private asset that can be moved to maximize its value for the owner and, through the fee, for his partners. The fans in the abandoned city are left with the same hollow silence that greeted Canton. Their loyalty monetized and then discarded. The system protects the right of capital to flow to its most lucrative outlet. The community, just as in Canton, is the collateral damage in the perpetual project of stabilizing and enriching the league as a whole. These modern parallels are not coincidental. They are evidence of a perfected system. The concussion settlements manage liability. The protest policies manage message. The relocation protocols manage geography and revenue. In every case, the league's response is designed to protect the institution's power, profitability, and control, just as the 1925 Constitution was designed to do. The individual player's health, the player's voice, the fan's heart, these are variables to be managed, costs to be contained, or sentiments to be harnessed. The NFL learned from Canton that uncontrolled crises can destroy you. So it built a system to control all crises, to turn every hurricane into a scheduled, manageable rainfall. The cycle is eternal because the blueprint works. It ensures survival. But it also asks at every turn what we are willing to sacrifice for that survival, and reminds us that the first thing sacrificed all the way back in Canton was the idea that the game belonged to anyone but the men who owned it. The machine is brilliant. It generates wealth, builds cities of light and sound every Sunday, and etches legends into culture. But machines do not feel. They do not ache. They do not forget. They convert raw material into product, and what cannot be used is discarded. From the very beginning, the raw material of the National Football League has been the human body and the human mind. The system engineered after Canton's fall was designed for one purpose: the permanence and prosperity of the club, and by extension, the league. In that equation, the individual is a variable, not a constant. His health is a budgetary concern. His longevity is a actuarial calculation. His pain is a private matter. His memory is his own problem. This is the player's burden, a weight that has been passed down like a sinister inheritance from the first pioneers to the modern gladiator. It is the cost of doing business in an empire that learned how to perfect everything except how to care for the men who built it. To follow this burden from Jim Thorpe to the present day is to trace a line of quiet suffering beneath the roar of the crowd, a lineage of broken men who were celebrated for what they could destroy on the field, and then left alone to deal with the destruction within themselves. Jim Thorpe's burden was symbolic and comprehensive. He carried the weight of a sport's legitimacy on his back until his spine could no longer hold it. His body, a marvel of nature, was used until the marvel was gone. Then, the institution that had clung to his fame let him go, offering no cushion, no pathway, no honor guard into a life after football. His later years, the odd jobs, the struggles, the feeling of being a relic in a world that had moved on, established the template. The league's love was conditional on utility. When your utility ends, you exit the stage. The machine thanks you with applause and then turns its attention to the next piece of raw material on the conveyor belt. Thorpe's tragedy was that he was the first to experience the full arc, to be used up completely, from the tapping of his celebrity to the last drop of sweat on the field. He was the prototype of the expendable asset. As the league stabilized under Carr's blueprint, the burden became more systematic, less about individual betrayal and more about institutional policy. The standard contract bound a man to a team, but it did not bind the team to the man's future. The player was an asset with a depreciating value. The goal was to extract maximum value during the peak depreciation curve. Medicine and training were not about lifelong health. They were about game day readiness. Painkillers, amphetamines, and cortisone shots were the tools of the trade, allowing damaged assets to remain operational on Sunday. The players of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were chemical pioneers, injecting themselves with substances they barely understood to meet the demands of the machine. Their bodies became battlefields, and the league's doctors were often quartermasters, supplying the ammunition to keep them fighting, with little thought for the long-term occupation. The stories are legion. Players given bennies to get up for a game, knees drained at halftime, shots of cortisone so frequent they rotted cartilage and bone. This was not malice, it was logistics. The system demanded performance. The individual's long-term health was a secondary consideration, a distant cost to be borne by the individual himself, long after the checks stopped clearing. The burden shifted from the purely physical to the cognitive with the dawn of the concussion crisis. Here, the expendability of the individual reached its most haunting dimension. For decades, the system treated the brain as just another joint to be numbed, another injury to be shaken off. Getting your bell rung was a rite of passage. The protocol was to hold up fingers, ask what day it was, and send the asset back onto the field. The brain was not an organ to be protected. It was a switch to be reset. This was the logical endpoint of a culture that prized toughness and sacrifice above all. The player, internalizing this culture, saw hiding a concussion as a badge of honor. The team, focused on winning the next game, had every incentive to agree. The league, focused on the product's violent appeal, had no incentive to look too deeply. So for generations, men like Mike Webster, John Mackey, and thousands of less famous others sacrificed their minds on the same altar where Thorpe had sacrificed his body. They left the game with their memories, their moods, and their personalities fundamentally altered, carrying a time bomb in their skulls. The burden became neurological, a slow, invisible erosion of the self. The machine had asked for everything, and it had taken what the player did not even know he could give, his own mind. In the modern era, the burden has been professionalized but not eliminated. The massive salaries are real, and they are a form of compensation for the understood risk. But the underlying calculation remains the same. The player is a high-performance instrument with a warranty period. The team invests in him to win games during that warranty. Sports science and injury management are now incredibly sophisticated, but their primary goal is still to maximize availability, not to ensure a healthy life at 50. The next man up philosophy is a mantra of resilience, but it is also a stark reminder of replaceability. When a star quarterback tears his ACL, the narrative is about the team's setback, the season's tragedy, the player's own pain, his grueling rehabilitation, his private fear that he may never be the same, is a subplot. The machine laments the loss of the asset while the human lives the loss. The final, chilling aspect of the burden is the psychological transition out of the machine. For years, a player's identity is forged in the fire of the NFL. He is a warrior, a teammate, a public figure. Then, often abruptly, it ends. The structure, the routine, the purpose, the adrenaline all vanish. The machine moves on. What is left is a man in his 30s or 40s with a battered body, a mind potentially scarred by trauma, and a profound sense of displacement. The league offers transition programs, but they cannot rebuild an identity. The rate of bankruptcy, divorce, depression, and substance abuse among former players is a statistical scream into the void, the direct consequence of being a high-value asset one day and a retired commodity the next. The system is not designed for the soft landing. It is designed for the hard, productive impact. What happens after the impact is not the league's operational concern. This, perhaps, is the ultimate burden, to have been so essential, so celebrated, and then to be so utterly peripheral to the machine you helped fuel. From Thorpe's lonely end to the modern star nervously awaiting his post-football diagnosis, the thread is unbroken. The NFL's order, born of necessity after Canton, created a magnificent, self-sustaining entity. But it did so by externalizing the true cost onto the individual player. His body pays the debt his contract cannot cover. His mind pays the interest. His later life lives with the default. The machine is permanent. The man is temporary. This is the foundational bargain, the original sin written into the first standard contract and renewed with every generation. We marvel at the spectacle, and we should. But we must also recognize the burden, carried in silence by thousands of men, a hidden weight in the glittering economy of modern football. It is the price of the order we so enjoy. And as the empire enters its second century, the question remains, having built a system perfect for its own survival, can it ever evolve to truly ensure the survival in health and dignity of the men it consumes? Or is the player's burden the eternal, non-negotiable term of service in the kingdom of football? The code is unbreakable because it was written in the language of survival. The decisions made in the mid-1920s, in direct response to the smoking crater where the Canton Bulldogs once stood, were not temporary fixes or policy adjustments. They were the genetic code for a new species of sports enterprise. Every strand of that DNA was engineered to correct a fatal flaw that had nearly caused the organism to die in its infancy. The territorial rule, the standard contract, the central authority, these were not suggestions. They were the immutable laws of a new universe. And the most profound legacy of those 1925 decisions is this: the NFL's power structure has proven immune to fundamental change not because of the stubbornness of individual owners or commissioners, but because the system is designed to be self-reinforcing, self-correcting, and self-perpetuating. It absorbs revolutions. It metabolizes crises. It turns threats into sources of strength. We are not merely observing the aftermath of Canton's fall a century later. We are living inside the fortress that was built from its stones. The world of modern professional football is the world created by that fallout, and every attempt to alter its foundation only seems to make the walls taller and the gates thicker. The immunity begins with the financial architecture. Revenue sharing among owners, the ultimate offspring of the territorial rights rule, created a perfect alignment of interests. It made the owners a monolithic class. There are no small market rebels in the NFL boardroom because there are no truly small markets in the financial sense. Green Bay shares in the Los Angeles television bounty. This eliminates the internal dissent that could fracture the cartel. When your competitor is also your business partner, your incentive is to protect the partnership, not undermine it. This unity gives the league a monolithic bargaining position against any external force, most notably the players' union. It creates a war chest of unimaginable depth to withstand strikes or litigation. The financial order born from the fear of another Canton-style raid has made the owner's collective position unassailable from the outside. To change the power structure, you would have to convince a group of billionaires to voluntarily dismantle the system that guarantees their profits and protects them from each other and from their labor. The code is unbreakable because it made the rulers perfectly content. This financial unity fuels the second pillar of immunity, the relentless, bureaucratic centralization of authority. Joseph Carr's office was a tiny seed. Today, it is a sovereign government with departments of security, public relations, legal affairs, and finance. The commissioner is not a facilitator. He is the chief executive of a single, unified corporation that licenses football operations to 32 franchise holders. This central authority administers the cap, distributes the shared revenue, negotiates the television contracts, and disciplines those who stray from the code. It is the enforcement mechanism for the owner's cartel. Any challenge, from a player protest to a rogue owner's comment, is met with the full weight of this centralized power, which speaks with one voice and acts with one purpose. This structure is the antithesis of the 1922 League, a cacophony of independent voices. By silencing dissent and streamlining command, the League presents an impregnable front. It is impossible to divide and conquer the NFL because it is no longer divided. It is a single entity with 32 branches. The code is unbreakable because there is no longer a plurality to break. When change is forced upon the system, the code dictates the method of absorption. We have seen it time and again. Free agency was forced upon the owners by legal defeat. The system absorbed it by coupling it with a salary cap, turning player mobility into a controlled variable within a fixed economic model. The concussion litigation presented an existential threat. The system absorbed it through a managed settlement, transforming a potential reputation-killing admission of guilt into a budgeted line item for neurological care. Social justice protests threatened the brand's apolitical harmony. The system first tried to suppress them through uniform policies, then partially absorbed them by sanctioning and marketing its own leak-controlled versions of the message. In each case, the system's response is not to reverse course, but to create a new rule, a new clause, a new protocol that allows the challenge to exist within the confines of the existing power structure. The challenge is neutralized, digitized, and integrated into the operating system. The league learned from Canton that uncontrolled external forces are deadly. So it developed an immune system that identifies foreign agents and creates antibodies to contain them. The code is unbreakable because it is adaptive. It learns, but it does not repent. Perhaps the most subtle and powerful aspect of this immunity is the cultural narrative the league has cultivated, culminating in the myth of Canton and the Hall of Fame. By controlling its own history, by sanding down the rough, brutal edges of its origin story, the NFL has created a powerful sentiment that defends the status quo. The league positions itself not as a ruthless corporation built on a calculated power grab, but as a cherished American institution that grew organically from humble, small-town roots. This narrative frames any fundamental criticism as an attack on tradition itself, on the game we love. When players ask for a greater share of revenue, they are framed as greedy men disrupting the sport. When cities protest franchise moves, they are framed as unfortunate but necessary casualties of progress. When cities protest franchise moves, they are framed as unfortunate but necessary casualties of progress. The league's immense popularity is its ultimate shield. It is difficult to muster sustained public outrage against an entity that provides a deeply valued cultural ritual every autumn weekend. The code is unbreakable because it has woven itself into the fabric of national identity. To challenge it feels un-American. And so we arrive at the present, living in the world that Canton's fall made. The player, for all his millions and his fame, remains bound by the spirit of the standard contract. His earning power and mobility circumscribed by a collectively bargained system designed for owner cost certainty. The owner, protected by revenue sharing and territorial monopolies, operates with a sovereignty that would make Sam Deutsch blush, free to move his franchise in search of greater public subsidies. The commissioner, wielding Carr's centralized authority, manages crises with the cold efficiency of a trauma surgeon, prioritizing the patient's survival over the comfort of any single cell. The fan, for all their passion, is a consumer in a protected market, their loyalty monetized and, if necessary, geographically discarded. The unbreakable code is the price of permanence. The NFL does not have dynasties and failures like the Canton Bulldogs anymore because the system will not allow it. It has engineered a universe of perpetual, stable competition where no team can truly rise too high or fall too low, where labor costs are fixed, and where the central authority guarantees the continuation of the game. It is the most successful sports league in history because it solved its original problem perfectly. It eliminated the chaos. It mastered the risk. It built a machine that could run forever. But as we stand here, a century removed from those fateful meetings, we must ask the question that the code itself is designed to suppress. Is this the only way? Is the totalitarian control of labor, the suppression of individual voice, the sacrifice of community, and the managed settlement of human suffering the necessary cost of the spectacle? The NFL's history argues that it is. The fall of the Canton Bulldogs proved that the alternative was ruin. The system we have is the system that survived. The code is unbreakable because it was forged in the fire of a failure so complete that the survivors vowed never to risk it again. They built a world without the possibility of another Canton. In doing so, they also built a world where the players, the fans, and the communities are forever secondary to the health of the machine itself. We are all living in that world. We cheer its triumphs. We wear its colors. We debate its dramas. But we do so within walls whose foundations were laid the day the champions died, and the empire decided that no single champion, no city, and no player would ever be indispensable again. The story we have traced is not a sports story. It is a founding myth, and like all founding myths, it contains a sacrifice. The Canton Bulldogs were not merely a team that failed. They were not a champion that grew old and faded away. They were ritualistically sacrificed on the altar of institutional survival. Their collapse was the necessary crisis, the terrifying proof that forced a collection of warring tribes to become a nation. Their ghost does not haunt the NFL in the sense of a sad memory. It is woven into the very circuitry of the league's power. Every time a general manager trades a veteran whose body is breaking down, the ghost of Jim Thorpe nods in recognition. Every time the league office levies a fine for conduct detrimental to the Shield, the specter of the Pottsville Maroons stands silently in the corner. Every time a collective bargaining agreement is signed, granting players a larger share of revenue but within a system of absolute owner control, the spirit of Joseph Carr oversees the signing. The fall of Canton was the original trauma, and the NFL has spent a century building a perfect, impenetrable fortress around that trauma to ensure it could never happen again. The question that lingers, the one that hangs in the air after the final whistle of this investigation, is whether the empire built from those ruthless, pragmatic principles can ever truly evolve beyond them. Or is it destined to forever be governed by the cold logic of its own birth? The price of the order we now take for granted was immense. It was paid in the currency of autonomy. The player's autonomy was the first to go, bound by the standard contract and its descendants. The owner's autonomy followed, surrendered to the central authority and the revenue-sharing pact. The city's autonomy was never even considered. A community's love was merely a market condition, subject to relocation formulas. What emerged was not a sports league, but a sovereign state with its own laws, its own economy, and its own foreign policy. It is a state that is brilliantly resilient. It survived wars with rival leagues, technological revolutions, and public health crises because its foundational code is about one thing above all else: the perpetuation of the state itself. The individual, whether a legend like Thorpe or a fan in St. Louis, is a subject of that state. Their needs are important only insofar as they do not conflict with the state's security and prosperity. This is the unvarnished truth of the Canton legacy. The league learned that to protect the game, it had to become something greater than the game, and in doing so, it sometimes had to betray the very people who believed the game was about them. We see this legacy in the gleaming billion-dollar stadiums that are monuments to this perfected order. They are not built for spontaneity or local character. They are optimized revenue engines, designed by the same architects, filled with the same luxury suites, hosting the same corporate-sponsored fan experiences. The game on the field is a masterpiece of controlled violence, played by athletes who are the products of a scientific talent pipeline, governed by instant replay and centralized command from New York. The chaos that birthed the sport, the muddy fields, the player jumpers, the town pride that could be stolen in a backroom deal, has been entirely eradicated. What we watch every Sunday is the triumph of the system over the sport's anarchic soul. It is spectacular, compelling, and emotionally powerful, but it is also managed, predictable, and safe for the institution. The ghost of Canton is the reason why. The fear of returning to that chaos, to that vulnerability, is the fuel that powers the machine's relentless drive for control. And yet, for all its power, the code faces new challenges that its 1925 authors could never have imagined. The concussion settlement, for all its calculated containment, has permanently altered the moral landscape. It has forced an acknowledgement, however legalistic and hedged, that the product has a cost that cannot be fully externalized onto the player alone. The player activism around social justice, though met with suppression and then cautious co-option, has proven that the modern athlete is more than an asset. He is a citizen with a voice, and the league's monolithic control of message is porous. The economic model, while staggeringly successful, creates such immense wealth that it constantly threatens to rupture from its own gravitational pull, inviting political and legal scrutiny that the old barriers of sports exceptionalism may not withstand. These are not existential threats like the AFL or the concussion lawsuits were. They are persistent moral aches in the body of the empire. They ask whether the system, designed for survival, can learn how to practice something resembling conscience. The possibility for evolution exists not in the tearing down of the fortress, which is unthinkable and unnecessary, but in the renegotiation of its purpose. Can the centralized authority, born to suppress raids and standardize contracts, be used to mandate genuine, lifelong health security for players? Not as a settled liability, but as a sacred obligation. Can the revenue-sharing model, created to protect owners from each other, be expanded in spirit to enforce a deeper, more meaningful partnership with the communities that host franchises, making relocation a true last resort rather than a leveraged financial tool? Can the league's narrative control, so expertly used to build the myth of Canton, be turned toward a more honest and less sentimental engagement with its own complex history, acknowledging the sacrifices as well as the triumphs? This would require a fundamental shift from seeing players, fans, and cities as variables in a stability equation to seeing them as stakeholders in a shared legacy. It would mean the empire choosing to be a republic. But the weight of history is heavy. The code is unbreakable because it works. It has delivered unimaginable success. Every time the league faces a crisis, its instincts are not to become more empathetic but to become more efficient. To manage, to settle, to control. These instincts saved it. They are hardwired. The men who run the NFL today are not the heirs to Carr's vision. They are its current custodians, living within a structure that predates them and will outlast them. To expect them to voluntarily dilute the power of that structure is to expect a revolution from the palace guard. So we are left with a reflection, not a prediction. The National Football League is the most dominant cultural and economic force in American sports because a group of terrified men in the 1920s stared into the abyss of Canton's empty stadium and swore to build something that could never fall. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They built a system so robust, so intelligent in its self-protection, that it converted every subsequent shock into a source of strength. But the price of that unbreakable order was a certain kind of soul. It traded the passionate, chaotic, and deeply human connection of the Ohio League for the flawless, predictable, and ultimately corporate spectacle of the modern Sunday. The ghost of the Canton Bulldogs does not haunt the league as a failure. It haunts the league as the forgotten price of its own perfection. It asks us, every time we lose ourselves in the roar of the crowd, to remember what was sacrificed to make that roar possible, and to wonder, as the empire enters its second century, if it might finally be secure enough, at long last, to listen to the whispers of its own ghosts. The game goes on. The machine hums. The code holds. But the question remains, lingering like the last echo of a final whistle in a town that once knew what it meant to truly love a team, and what it meant to have that love taken away. Having built the perfect fortress, is there anyone left inside who remembers what it was like to live outside the walls?